Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity settles down beside you like an old friend, and ancient mysteries drift in and out of the quiet the way a tide moves across the shore. Tonight, we're taking a slow, unhurried look at a question as old as the first stories ever carved into clay and whispered over dying campfires. It's one of those ideas that seems too big, too unlikely, and yet somehow too persistent to ignore. The thought that a wandering world, a hidden planet, maybe even the one some call Nibiru, might have brushed close enough to Earth to send the oceans rising faster than whole civilizations could breathe. A flood so enormous, so devastating, that nearly every culture on the planet kept a memory of it alive. Not in the same place, not in the same time, not in the same words, and yet, somehow, always the same story. Before we wade into that deep water, though, I'd love to know something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're stretched out on the couch after a long day, or perhaps you're tucked into bed hoping this quiet corner of calm helps you drift a little easier. Whatever the hour is where you are, it's a good time to be here. If you find these slow journeys soothing or they help you unwind, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this cozy little space travel a bit farther, reaching others who might need the gentle company of a story that doesn't rush. Now don't worry, even though we're talking about floods and wandering planets, nothing tonight is meant to quicken your pulse. If anything, we're about to stroll through questions that have puzzled scholars, astronomers, storytellers, and nighttime thinkers for centuries. Questions that never need to be solved in one sitting. Questions you can fall asleep halfway through without missing anything important, because they'll be right here waiting for you again. So get comfortable, loosen your shoulders, and let your breath move at its own pace. We're going to drift into one of humanity's oldest memories, a memory that somehow exists everywhere at once, a memory of water rising, a memory of a sky that changed, a memory of the world almost starting over, and somewhere in the middle of it all a distant world with a long, slow path around the sun. Long before satellites and telescopes, long before maps, long before the word planet meant what it means to us now, people looked up at the night sky and believed it held all the answers they would ever need. Every bright point of light had a personality, a reason, a story, a history. If the sky changed, then the world changed. If something strange moved across the heavens, people took note of it. They carved those notes into clay tablets, painted them on temple walls, repeated them to their children so the story would never be lost. Among the oldest of those sky stories is Nibiru. To some scholars it was a star, to others a sign, to still others a wandering world, passing through every few thousand years like a cosmic visitor with questionable timing. And wrapped around that name, tightly knotted and difficult to unravel, is another story even older. A story that appears in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Greece, in China, across Native American traditions, in Hindu texts, in the Pacific Islands, in Scandinavian myths, and in places separated by oceans long before anyone built the ships needed to cross them. The story of a flood that covered everything. It wasn't a gentle rise of the tide or a bad storm season. It wasn't a list of heavy rains recorded by a bored scribe. This was something enormous, something civilization-ending, something that wiped the world clean enough that only a handful of survivors remained to tell the tale. And despite the distance between these cultures, despite the different languages, landscapes, and beliefs, the details line up far too neatly to ignore. There is always a warning, there is always a flood, there is always someone who survives because they listened, and there is always a sense that the sky had something to do with it. For some, the sky sent the rain. For others, the sky cracked open. For others still, a heavenly body brushed near enough to stir the oceans. Now, before anyone gets too carried away, none of this is about proving anything. Tonight is simply about exploring the possibility that ancient memories might hold more than metaphor, and that a world like Nibiru, if it existed, could have caused disturbances great enough to reshape the Earth's surface. What makes this particularly interesting is that our planet remembers disasters far better than we do. Ice cores keep records like librarians. Ocean sediments store long timelines of climate swings. Tree rings quietly note centuries of strange seasons. And myths, for all their dramatic storytelling, have an uncanny way of preserving the skeleton of real events, even when the details shift. The idea that a passing planet could influence Earth isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Gravity is both subtle and relentless. A massive body moving close enough could pull at the oceans, tilt the axis, disrupt the climate, or even release enormous amounts of stored water in the form of melting ice or catastrophic rainfall. It doesn't need to crash into anything. It doesn't need to be visible to the naked eye for long. It only needs to come close enough, once, for the world to feel it. Ancient people may not have understood orbital mechanics, but they understood the sky. They tracked movements with an attention we rarely use anymore. Their records included patterns we now identify as planets, comets, eclipses, precession cycles, and seasonal changes tied to the stars. If something unusual passed overhead, even briefly, the event would have echoed through their entire worldview. And that brings us back to the flood. One of the strangest things about the Great Flood myth is how coordinated it seems. Cultures with no shared language, no shared roots, and no shared migration history all tell a version of the same catastrophic event. Not small floods, not long monsoon years, a global reset. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes waters rising high enough to swallow mountains. The biblical story of Noah mirrors details from Mesopotamian sources almost exactly. In India, the tale of Manu describes a flood so massive that humanity needed to be saved by a sacred being. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive by retreating to a vessel as the rest of the world drowns. In China, the story of Gun and Yu tells of unstoppable waters that reshape the land. In Native American lore, the earth is cleansed by a deluge that forces people onto mountain peaks or into boats. In the Pacific Islands, flood stories are woven into cultural identity. In Scandinavia, the world is washed away before a new one rises. So many stories, so many places, so many echoes. This isn't the kind of thing that happens by coincidence. Floods are common, of course, but floods of this magnitude are not. For so many cultures to preserve a matching memory, something extraordinary had to have taken place, something vast enough to leave a mark on the entire world, something powerful enough to make the ocean behave like an animal breaking free from its cage. Some researchers point to the end of the last ice age, when huge glacial lakes broke loose and surged across continents. Others point to rapid climate shifts caused by volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts. And then there are those who think a passing planet could have tugged at Earth's climate system, pulling the delicate balance of ice, heat, and ocean currents into chaos. Nibiru, in this sense, isn't an invention of modern internet rumour. The concept of a crossing world, a wandering object with a long and mysterious orbit, has been around for thousands of years. The name appears in ancient Mesopotamian texts that reference unusual celestial alignments and a star or planet associated with upheaval. Whether that meant an actual planet or something symbolic is still debated, but the connection between sky events and earthly disasters was very real to the people who recorded them. And while modern astronomers tend to roll their eyes at the idea of a rogue world swinging near Earth every few thousand years, they do acknowledge that our solar system has hosted many wandering bodies. Some were captured, some were ejected, some passed through briefly, and some left scars we still see on the Moon, Mars and Mercury. Even today, researchers are still searching for a large planet far beyond Neptune, often called Planet 9. Its existence isn't confirmed, but the gravitational behaviour of distant objects suggests something is out there. Something massive, something slow, something that doesn't care about our definitions or comfort. If such an object exists now, who's to say others didn't exist long before we started keeping accurate records? As we move forward, we'll take our time exploring the pieces of this puzzle, the ancient flood stories, the astronomical possibilities, the geological clues, and the long echo of human memory. There's no rush, no need to solve anything all at once, just steady curiosity, the kind that helps the mind settle while it wanders. So, let's continue drifting through the deep past. Because somewhere between clay tablets, rising oceans, and a wandering world, there might be a thread tying everything together, and we're just beginning to follow it. When people think about the ancient world, they often picture deserts, temples, stone ruins, or quiet villages scattered along wide rivers. But if you go far enough back, long before writing took hold, before cities rose, before knowledge settled into reliable shapes, the world was a place where the most powerful truths weren't written down at all. They were told in stories, repeated by memory, shaped by experience, and passed from one generation to the next with a seriousness that came from living close to nature. And in those early stories, one force appeared again and again, stronger than wind, older than kings, more feared than any enemy. Water. Not the familiar kind that fills jars or flows in streams. The kind that arrives without warning. The kind that takes the land, the animals, the homes, the people. The kind that does not stop when people shout at it or pray at it or climb to higher ground. For those early humans, water was both life and danger. It grew the food, filled the fishing nets, and carved out the lands where people lived. But it also held the power to erase everything. That fear shaped their earliest attempts to make sense of the world. Long before there were words to describe oceans rising or rivers bursting, before numbers were used to measure rainfall or tides, communities relied on observation. They watched the skies, listened to the winds, followed the birds, learned the habits of rivers, and memorized the behaviors of storms. These weren't scientific studies in the modern sense, but they were scientific in spirit. Survival depended on understanding patterns, even if those patterns were wrapped in myth. In those earliest ages when the world felt larger because knowledge travelled slowly, people learned to explain harsh events using the tools they had: memory, imagination, comparison, and the need to find meaning in what they could not control. When the rains fell harder than anything they had seen, when rivers spilled into plains, when storms raged for days, the stories formed not as metaphors, but as attempts to describe something real. People didn't create myths because they loved fiction. They created them because they needed explanations to pass down, something sturdy enough to help the next generation survive what they had lived through. In place after place, separated by mountains, deserts, oceans, and centuries, people told stories of a great flood. Some described it as punishment, others as cleansing, others as an accident, the kind nature makes when too much builds up and release becomes inevitable. But the common thread was always the same. Water came. It covered everything. Only a few survived. This shared memory, scattered across continents, begins to look less like imagination and more like a historical echo. A memory of something so significant that no small story could carry it. A memory so widespread that even cultures with no contact preserved a similar version of it. This persistence suggests that in the deep past something happened. It doesn't tell us exactly what or when, but it tells us that the earliest humans lived through events large enough to reshape landscapes and beliefs. Many of these early stories began before written language. Their details changed slowly over time as each generation retold them, adding local features, emphasizing survival in their specific regions, sometimes adding divine characters or placing the event into their own cosmology. But beneath the layers of storytelling sits an older core, one tied to the memory of an enormous flood. In Mesopotamia, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, these stories eventually found their way onto clay tablets. But the myths themselves were far older than the tablets. People had been repeating them long before scribes learned to carve their symbols. In the version that eventually appeared in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero meets a survivor of a massive flood that wiped out humanity. This tale was already ancient when the tablets were written. Archaeologists have traced its roots deeper and deeper, finding older versions each time, which suggests that even the earliest written forms were retelling of something older still. The Sumerians, who lived in a region defined by rivers prone to unpredictable flooding, treated the flood story as part of their understanding of how the world had once changed. They didn't treat it as a metaphor, they treated it as a real event. Their king lists even placed the reigns of rulers before and after the flood, as if they were recording history, not imagination. Whether they were correct about the specifics or not, the fact that they saw the flood as a dividing line between epochs is important. Something had convinced them that the world had been reset. Far from Mesopotamia, similar ideas appear in other early cultures. In ancient India, early versions of the story of Manu describe a flood so great that the world nearly vanished beneath it. The details shift across versions, but the central event remains. Water rises. It does not stop. A survivor escapes. The world begins again. In early Greek stories, water does the same thing. The world is submerged. Only a few escape. Land appears slowly again as the waters recede. The same structure, the same scale, the same destructive power. Indigenous people across North America kept their own versions, some simpler, some more elaborate, all describing waters rising rapidly and forcing people, animals, or sacred beings to flee. The stories differ in tone, but not in the magnitude of the event. For them, the flood was not an invention. It was a memory. In early Chinese traditions, great floods appear in the earliest records of dynasties, sometimes linked to heroes tasked with controlling waters that refuse to recede. The scale of these events suggests more than seasonal flooding. It suggests a cataclysm that left deep marks on the land and its people. When people in the Pacific Islands spoke of floods, their stories had the same structure, even though those islands were isolated for thousands of years. When people in South America described world-changing waters, their stories also aligned. The patterns repeat across continents that had no contact until many millennia later. This widespread consistency raises a question. How could so many cultures, separated by vast distances and separated by time, all remember an event of the same kind? If the stories were simple explanations for local disasters, they would differ more, but they do not. They match in scale. They match in the suddenness of the event. They match in the total transformation of the world. This suggests that the earliest humans may have witnessed a period in Earth's history marked by rapid and extreme changes in water systems. These could have been caused by melting ice sheets, sudden releases of glacial lakes, shifting rainfall patterns, or geological activity that disrupted coastlines. All of these are plausible, but some researchers explore another possibility, that a celestial event may have triggered or intensified these conditions. In early eras, people did not separate the sky from the land the way modern science does. To them, the two were connected. If the sky changed, the world changed. If something bright or unusual appeared overhead before a disaster, they remembered it. They described it as a sign, an omen, or a moving star. In some cases, they assigned it a name. If that name appeared again in later traditions, it is possible that the memory of that object survived through time. Some thinkers see in these stories the early impressions of a wandering object, something with a long, slow path, something that moved through the sky in ways that did not match the ordinary patterns. If such an object approached Earth, even if it passed at a safe distance, its gravitational pull could have created tidal forces or shifts in climate that affected the distribution of water across the planet. Not through direct collision, but through influence. Gravity does not require impact. It only requires proximity and mass. The earliest humans, of course, had no concept of gravitational fields. They would not have understood the mechanics of orbital interactions, but they would have seen the effects, and they would have turned those effects into stories that made sense to them. When the rains came suddenly, when rivers tore through valleys, when coastlines disappeared, they might have linked those events to whatever unusual thing they remembered seeing in the sky before it happened. These stories, shaped by memory and retelling, eventually became the myths we now read in ancient texts. But beneath the mythic language lies a simple pattern. Something happened. It was large. It involved water. It affected entire populations. It left a deep mark. When communities tried to rebuild after such an event, the memory of it became a guiding story. Something to teach children. Something to explain why the land looked the way it did. Something to remind people of the dangers they had survived. Over time, as writing developed, those stories were recorded. They took on new layers as religions shaped them and as societies changed. But the foundation remained the same, and that foundation goes back to a time when the world had no written records, no carved stones marking the centuries, no calendars dividing time. It goes back to a time when people relied on stories to hold on to the past. Stories were their timelines, their warnings, and their way of making sense of overwhelming events. This period, when myths first learned to speak of water, marks the moment when memory transitioned into narrative. It marks the beginning of humanity's attempt to document disaster. It marks the point when survival, observation, and imagination combined into history told through spoken tradition. And it marks the moment when the flood story first took shape, not as a fantasy, but as a record of something that happened before anyone had the tools to measure it. These early stories would later evolve into the flood accounts we recognize today. Some became religious texts, some remained folklore, some were lost until archaeologists uncovered them. But all of them trace back to a time when the world was young and humanity was still learning how to describe the forces that shaped its fate. As we move forward, we'll explore how these stories began to connect with early observations of the sky, and how the memory of a wandering world might have blended with the memory of rising waters. Because in the deep layers of these myths, the links between sky and sea often run side by side, forming a picture that becomes clearer the longer we look at it. When people in the ancient world looked up at the night sky, they weren't doing it casually. They weren't glancing at it between busy tasks or checking it the way we check a screen. They watched it because the sky was their clock, their calendar, their map, and sometimes the only reliable guide they had. Every shift in the heavens meant something. If a new star appeared, if a bright object moved in a way no one had seen before, or if patterns changed too quickly, the event carried weight. The world above was a place of signals, and people took those signals seriously. In many early cultures, unusual objects or movements in the sky became part of the stories that explained how the universe worked. These weren't just decorative myths. They were attempts to understand the world using the best tools available at the time: observation, memory, and interpretation. When something unfamiliar appeared overhead, people remembered it. They described it. They tied it to events that happened on the ground. And if the event was impactful enough, it became the seed of a story repeated for thousands of years. This is the context in which Nibiru first enters human history, not as an internet theory or a modern idea, but as a word found in some of the oldest written sources in existence. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia mention a celestial body associated with crossing or transition. The word itself carries meanings related to this movement: a crossing point, a path, a transition. These descriptions were part astronomical, part symbolic, and part observational. People saw something move in ways that didn't match the ordinary behaviour of the known planets. They recorded what they saw the best way they could. In some texts, Nibiru appears as a star. In others, a planet. In still others, a marker of celestial events. These differences might seem contradictory at first, but they're not unusual for early astronomy. Without telescopes, without precise instruments, categories were fluid. If an object was bright one year and dim the next, it might be described differently by different generations. If its position shifted compared to familiar constellations, it might be given a special name, and if it appeared irregularly, it would stand out even more. To early skywatchers, the predictable planets like Venus or Jupiter weren't mysteries. Their motions followed recognizable patterns, but something with a long orbit, something that appeared only after many lifetimes, or moved slowly enough to confuse even the most careful observers, would attract attention. That attention could easily turn into myth, not in the sense of invention, but in the sense of meaning. People needed explanations for what they were seeing, and they built those explanations from the fragments of knowledge available to them. Mesopotamian astronomers were among the most advanced in the ancient world. They tracked planetary movements with remarkable accuracy, recorded eclipses, noted irregularities, and created catalogues that served as the foundation for later astronomy. If something in the sky behaved strangely, they were the ones most likely to notice. And when they used a specific term like Nibiru to describe a recurring but unusual celestial presence, the idea took hold. In early texts, Nibiru is sometimes linked to Marduk, a major deity. But this doesn't automatically make the object mythological. Early cultures often attached gods to planets they could see. Venus became associated with Ishtar, Jupiter with Marduk, Saturn with Ninurta. The presence of a god's name didn't make the planet imaginary. It simply reflected the culture's habit of assigning divine roles to prominent objects in the sky. So if Nibiru was occasionally described as a divine aspect of Marduk, that doesn't tell us whether the object was literal or symbolic. It only tells us how people interpreted it. What makes the references to Nibiru particularly interesting is the emphasis on crossing, not simply movement, but a distinct kind of motion, something that shifts from one region of the sky to another, something that marks a transition or divides seasons, something that appears when something significant is happening. The text rarely gives specific instructions or detailed observations, but the repeated use of the crossing idea suggests that ancient observers noticed an object whose movements were different enough to earn a unique designation. Later, scholars tried to identify this object with known planets like Jupiter or Mercury, or with certain stars that played important roles in navigation or seasonal tracking. In some contexts, those identifications make sense, in others, less so. That inconsistency is part of what keeps Nibiru interesting. It's not locked to one explanation. It shifts depending on the text, the era, and the astronomical understanding of the time. An object with an extremely long orbit, or one whose visibility changed drastically depending on position, would easily fit into this category. To some generations it might have resembled a star, to others a planet, to others still something entirely unique. If Nibiru did refer to a literal celestial body, one possibility is that it wasn't always visible. Some planets or large objects in highly elongated orbits spend most of their time far from the Sun, too faint to detect without modern technology. When they approach the inner solar system, they become brighter and easier to observe. If such an object entered the inner regions only once every few thousand years, ancient astronomers might have recorded its appearance only occasionally. Those rare appearances, spaced centuries apart, could explain why some references seem disconnected or conflicting. People recorded what they saw, but they may not have seen it often enough to identify a consistent pattern. Objects with extremely long orbits aren't hypothetical. Astronomers studying distant regions of the solar system have found evidence of large bodies, far larger than asteroids, that follow paths hundreds or even thousands of years long. Some are nearly invisible unless they happen to reflect sunlight at the right angle. Some never come anywhere near Earth. Others may have passed closer in the distant past, their orbits altered by interactions with larger planets, or by the slow drift that affects distant objects over time. If such a body had an orbit that intersected or approached the path of known planets, ancient observers would have considered it unusual. They would have used special terms, linked it to gods, and recorded its arrival with more intensity than their notes on predictable planets. To them, something rare was something meaningful, and meaning tended to become myth. These early perceptions might explain why the memory of Nibiru blended with accounts of significant events on Earth. If a rare celestial object appeared during a period marked by change, destruction, or environmental upheaval, the two might become connected in the stories that survived. People living near rivers that flooded unpredictably might see a bright or strange object in the sky and associate the two events. This wasn't superstition. It was pattern-seeking based on limited information. If the world was changing below and something unusual appeared above, it made sense to connect them. This connection between sky and earth appears in many ancient cultures. The idea that unusual celestial events could accompany earthly disasters is common across early stories, not because people imagined connections where none existed, but because they were trying to make sense of overwhelming events. If a comet appeared before a major flood or a volcanic eruption, people remembered both events together. If an unfamiliar object moved across the sky before a period of unusual rainfall or shifts in seasons, the association stuck. For the earliest humans, the sky was a reflection of the world they lived in. They didn't treat it as a distant, separate place. It was woven into the land itself. A strange event overhead could easily become part of the story explaining what happened on the ground. Over time, those stories grew into the myths we now read in ancient literature. In some eras, the references to Nibiru appear alongside records of dramatic weather. In others, the name arises in periods marked by territorial shifts or natural disasters. While this doesn't prove anything about the object itself, it suggests a pattern. When the world changed abruptly, people looked to the sky for reasons, and if a rare object appeared during such a time, the event became significant enough to record. What makes this connection especially intriguing is that these stories didn't stay confined to one region. They spread. They inspired variations in nearby cultures. They influenced neighbouring kingdoms, and in some cases they travelled astonishing distances. Ideas about a crossing world appear indirectly in other mythologies as well, though with different names and different layers attached. Some cultures spoke of a stranger star. Others described a red object. Others spoke of a visitor that returned at long intervals. The details differ, but the pattern remains. Across the world, long before modern astronomy, people believed that unusual celestial motions could shape the fate of the Earth. They believed that the sky was full of signals, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. If the sky behaved strangely, something on the ground might follow. That belief shaped their interpretations of disasters, migrations, climate shifts, and the great changes that affected their ancestors. It's no surprise, then, that the memory of Nibiru became intertwined with stories of the Great Flood. Even if the object's role was symbolic in some interpretations, the connection between an unusual sky event and a massive upheaval on Earth was strong enough to endure. The earliest people didn't separate cosmology from geology or weather from astronomy. They saw the natural world as one system. When part of it changed, the rest followed. As writing developed, these early stories crystallized into more structured forms. Scribes, priests, and scholars began organizing the knowledge passed down to them. They took the early mentions of unusual celestial events and placed them into coherent frameworks. They described cycles, named objects, and assigned roles to stars and planets. Some of these writings focused on rituals and religious symbolism. Others were surprisingly technical, listing observations of planetary movements and creating early models of the cosmos. Within these growing bodies of knowledge, Nibiru retained its connection to crossing, transition, and unusual movement. Whether symbolic or observational, the term survived for centuries. That longevity suggests it wasn't a casual detail. It meant something important, something that later generations felt compelled to preserve, even if they no longer saw the object that inspired the term. When modern scholars encountered these references, they tried to interpret the word through the lens of known astronomy. Some identified it with Jupiter, others with specific stars, still others with broader seasonal markers. Each interpretation explains part of the evidence, but not all of it. That gap leaves room for the possibility that Nibiru referred to something less familiar, something that didn't behave like the predictable planets, something that may have appeared only rarely. This persistent ambiguity is part of what keeps the idea alive, not as a prediction, not as a certainty, but as a thread woven through some of the oldest stories humanity has ever recorded. A thread connecting early attempts to understand the sky with early attempts to explain catastrophes on the ground. As we continue, we'll start looking more closely at how ancient cultures interpreted these unusual sky events, and how those interpretations became linked with one of the most widespread memories in human history, the flood that nearly erased the world. The story is still unfolding, moving from early observations to the moments when skywatchers and storytellers began connecting celestial phenomena to the sudden rise of the waters. Long before cities rose into the shapes we know, long before mathematics found its way onto tablets and scrolls, there were people who devoted their lives to watching the sky. Not casually, not as a pastime, and not as entertainment. They watched because understanding the heavens was one of the most practical skills a person could possess. A well-trained observer could predict the coming rains, identify the right moment to plant crops, track seasons, navigate long distances, and warn communities when something unusual was approaching. For ancient people, the sky wasn't a distant backdrop. It was a living system, a source of information that could make the difference between thriving and struggling. In every region of the world, there were specialists who took this responsibility seriously. They were the earliest astronomers, though they wouldn't have used that word. They were priests, scholars, navigators, storytellers, elders, and people whose sharp memories made them valuable to their communities. Their work involved watching night after night, memorizing positions of stars, noting the rise and fall of certain objects, and comparing what they saw to what their ancestors had recorded. This attention wasn't driven by curiosity alone, it was driven by necessity. When you live in a world without electric lights, without digital calendars, without satellite weather forecasts, and without artificial boundaries between daily life and natural cycles, the sky becomes a guidebook. Every shift is meaningful. Every bright newcomer, every dimming star, every wandering object holds purpose. It was in this environment of constant observation that the earliest warnings were formed. People didn't wait for disasters to happen before trying to explain them. They looked for patterns that might help them avoid danger in the first place. If a certain star rose at a particular time of year, they knew floods might follow. If a bright object crossed a familiar path, they took it seriously. If something appeared that no one could explain, they didn't dismiss it. They examined it, discussed it, and passed the observations down through stories and rituals. In places like Mesopotamia, the people who watched the sky built entire systems around their knowledge. They kept long records of star positions, planetary motions, eclipses, and irregular events. These records weren't just lists, they were tools for prediction. Scribes could look at what had come before and estimate what might come next. The idea that the sky held signs wasn't superstition. It was the result of careful tracking across many generations. Over time, these observers noticed that certain patterns repeated while others didn't. The predictable motions of Venus, Jupiter, and other planets made them reliable markers. But there were also events that didn't fit. Bright objects that flared briefly and disappeared, streaks of light with long tails, stars that shifted position or brightness, and in rare cases something that moved in ways that earned special names. These skywatchers were not alone in their careful observations. Across the world, other cultures did similar work, each in their own way. In Egypt, priests recorded rising and setting stars to track the annual flooding of the Nile. They knew that certain stars appearing at dawn meant the river would rise soon. Their calendars revolved around this event, and their temples were aligned with astronomical points that marked the beginning of important cycles. Watching the sky was not optional. It was essential for survival, especially in a place where the river's behaviour defined the entire landscape. In China, observers created some of the oldest, continuous astronomical records known. They noted comets, novas, irregular planetary motion, and unusual sky events with remarkable precision. Their early writings describe bright objects appearing suddenly, disappearing quickly, or behaving in ways that did not match the familiar cycles. These observations were preserved in imperial archives, where generations of scholars compared new events to old ones. In Mesoamerica, cultures such as the Maya built structures aligned with solstices and equinoxes, mapped cycles of Venus, and tracked long calendars that stretched far into the past and future. Their skywatchers weren't merely estimating. They built entire systems based on long cycles that connected cosmic patterns to earthly rhythms. In Polynesia, navigators read the sky to travel across immense distances. They knew the positions of hundreds of stars, used them to find islands thousands of miles apart, and recognized shifts in sky patterns that signaled approaching storms or favourable conditions. Their knowledge wasn't written. It was memorized, practiced, and handed down in ways that ensured accuracy. These examples show that ancient skywatchers weren't mystics staring upward in wonder without understanding. They were careful, disciplined observers whose work was grounded in reality. Their records weren't vague. They were detailed enough that modern researchers still study them. It's within this vast network of early observational knowledge that humanity first noticed unusual movements in the heavens, movements that didn't match the ordinary behaviour of known objects. Some of these unusual events were comets, some were novas, some were meteors, but others were slower, steadier, and harder to categorise. They moved like planets, but not like the ones people recognised. If a rare object entered the inner solar system for a limited time, ancient skywatchers would have noticed. If it returned after enough generations had passed, they might have recognised it as the same object or described it with a term that conveyed crossing or transition. This is how the idea of unusual celestial visitors entered early stories. Those visitors were not always associated with disaster. Many were simply noted. But when unusual events in the sky coincided with disruptions on the ground, floods, storms, long seasons of rain, strange climatic patterns, the association between heaven and earth solidified. These associations weren't only symbolic, they were practical. If a particular sky event had preceded a disaster once, observers might treat it as a warning in the future. One important aspect of ancient astronomy is its long memory. Modern people tend to think in decades or at most centuries, but ancient observers often thought in larger scales. They preserved knowledge through stories that lasted thousands of years. In oral cultures, memory wasn't a simple act of recall. It was a skill honed through constant repetition. The stories they kept were the ones they considered essential. Stories of disasters were especially likely to survive, because teaching them to the next generation could protect the community. This long memory is part of why the concept of a crossing world endured. The word used in ancient texts carried the idea of a body that moved differently from predictable planets. Whether the object was a star, a planet, or a marker used to describe a region of the sky, the concept remained tied to transition. And transition often implied significance. When the earliest humans experienced floods, famine, or sudden climate shifts, they didn't have meteorological data to analyse. They had the sky. If something bright appeared before the rains arrived, the connection stayed in memory. If an unfamiliar object moved overhead before rivers overflowed, that detail entered the story. And if a rare celestial visitor returned after many generations, the memory of previous events might resurface and blend with the new observations. Many cultures have accounts in which skywatchers warn their leaders of impending events. These warnings often appear in stories about floods, storms, or great changes. In these narratives, the skywatcher notices something unusual. They recognise a pattern, they advise preparation, and even if the advice is ignored, the record of the warning becomes part of the cultural story. This structure appears in Mesopotamian flood legends, in early Chinese writings, in Mesoamerican accounts, in Polynesian oral histories, and in traditions across the Middle East. The details differ, but the framework is the same. Watchers see something in the sky, they voice concern, events follow. Over time, these stories solidified into organised traditions. Priests and scholars took on the responsibility of interpreting celestial signs. They created systems linking specific sky events to specific outcomes. Some of those interpretations were symbolic, others were based on accurate, consistent observations. In many cultures, eclipses were interpreted as warnings. Comets were treated as messengers. But slow-moving objects that didn't fit known patterns were more mysterious. They were harder to explain. They didn't always return within a human lifetime. When they did return, they sometimes brought disruption that observers couldn't ignore. In the fertile regions of the ancient world, where early civilizations grew around rivers and depended on seasonal cycles, consistency was everything. A small shift in rainfall could devastate crops. A sudden rise in water could destroy settlements. If a rare celestial event happened near the time of a disaster, the memory of that event became part of the story explaining what happened. Some scholars argue that early sky watchers overestimated the connection between the heavens and daily life. But when you consider how closely their survival depended on recognizing patterns, it becomes clear that they were not guessing. They were interpreting based on repeated observations. If they connected unusual sky events to unusual ground events, it was because they had seen it happen. The idea that the heavens held warnings was not superstition. It was an early form of predictive science. If something unusual appeared, people paid attention, not because they feared the sky, but because the sky had proven itself valuable. It's in this long, steady habit of watching and interpreting that the earliest references to a crossing world fit. Observers saw something rare enough to deserve a special term. They linked its movements to changes on the ground, and because those changes were significant, the memory endured. As human societies became more complex, sky watchers grew more specialized. Temples were built with astronomical alignments. Observatories were constructed in places like Babylon, Alexandria, Xi'an, and across Mesoamerica. Astronomers became trusted advisors to rulers. Their warnings could influence decisions about planting, warfare, migration, or construction. In this atmosphere of careful record-keeping and interpretation, the memory of unusual celestial objects survived far longer than any individual observer. Generations of sky watchers passed down their knowledge with precision. When scribes eventually wrote these observations onto clay or carved them into stone, the memories gained permanence. Even if the object never reappeared, the record stayed. These early observations became the backbone of later interpretations that linked celestial visitors to major events in human history, including the Great Flood. The flood stories themselves were already ancient by the time they were written. If they included references to unusual sky behavior, those references came from memories preserved across countless generations. This long chain of observation and storytelling reveals a simple pattern. Ancient people didn't ignore the sky. They didn't misunderstand it. They didn't invent meaning without reason. They watched it carefully, recorded what they saw, and passed those records to their descendants. If something unusual appeared, they noticed. If it returned, they remembered. If a major event followed, they connected the two, not carelessly, but because they had seen patterns that mattered. As we continue, we'll follow how these careful observations began to influence the earliest flood accounts, and how communities linked the rise of the waters to what they saw above. The next layers of the story move deeper into the moments when the sky changed, rivers swelled, and people began recording more than just patterns. They began recording experiences that would shape human memory for millennia. When people today think about ancient floods, they often imagine a single legendary event tied to one culture or one story. But if you look closely at the world's earliest records, a much larger pattern emerges. Nearly every ancient civilization, no matter where it lived or how its society formed, had a memory of waters rising in ways that reshaped their world. Not seasonal floods, not long rainy periods. Events so large, so disruptive, and so far-reaching that entire landscapes changed. Shorelines moved, rivers carved new paths, communities vanished, and the people who survived carried the memory forward with a seriousness that only comes from living through something that upends everything you thought was stable. These stories weren't written all at once. They lived inside communities long before writing existed, held in memory by elders, priests, navigators, and storytellers. And because these memories were important, they were repeated with great care. Accuracy mattered, details mattered, the devastation mattered. People wanted the next generation to understand what had happened so they could be prepared, if preparation was even possible. When these stories were eventually written down, they took on different shapes depending on the culture. Some became religious texts, others became myths. Others were woven into the early historical records of their people. But beneath all those variations sits a shared understanding. At some point in the distant past, the oceans rose in ways no one could forget. In Mesopotamia, where some of the oldest written documents were created, these memories appear in both mythic and semi-historical forms. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes a detailed account of a flood so massive that only one man was warned in time to build a vessel. This story contains practical descriptions, waterproofing the boat, gathering animals, closing the door, sending out birds to find dry land. These details weren't meant to sound magical. They were meant to sound real, because they were drawn from memories of actual experience. But the flood story in Gilgamesh wasn't the first of its kind. Older Sumerian tablets also describe waters rising suddenly, wiping out entire settlements and forcing the survivors to rebuild in new locations. Archaeologists studying the region have found layers of river deposits and silt that mark periods of extreme flooding. Some were regional, but others appear more widespread, large enough to leave traces across multiple ancient cities. These events happened long before the myths were written, suggesting that the stories preserved memories stretching deep into the past. Elsewhere in the ancient Near East, versions of the flood story took different forms. In the Hebrew tradition, the flood became a central narrative in religious texts, reinforced through generations of retelling. But this story didn't appear out of nowhere. It shares clear similarities with older Mesopotamian versions, indicating that the memory of the flood moved across cultures as people migrated, traded, married, and shared their histories. Moving from the Middle East to South Asia, early Indian traditions contain their own intricate memories of a great deluge. In the story of Manu, a terrible flood covers the world, and a survivor is guided to safety with the help of a sacred being. The cultural framing changes, but the structure remains familiar. Sudden rising waters, widespread destruction, and survival by preparation or warning. Scholars believe this story may preserve memories of catastrophic flooding during the end of the last ice age, when large glacial lakes in the region burst and transformed entire landscapes. Travel further west to Greece, and the pattern appears again. In the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the world is once again consumed by rising waters. Only a few survive to rebuild civilization. Greek storytellers preserved practical details as well. Vessels prepared in haste, mountain refuges, slow receding waters, which mirror the structure of flood stories from other parts of the world. The same is true in early Chinese traditions. Ancient texts describe devastating floods that spread across vast regions, sometimes lasting years. These weren't gentle rising waters. They were disruptive enough to appear in early dynastic histories, described in terms that suggest the event had shaped the land so drastically that new systems of governance emerged as a response. Some scholars connect these stories to large-scale flooding events caused by early climate shifts in the region, which would have profoundly impacted people who depended on rivers for agriculture and stability. Indigenous cultures across North America also maintained memories of vast floods. Different tribes preserved different details, but many speak of waters covering the land, carrying people away, or forcing communities to flee to high ground. These stories often include elements of survival, rafts, elevated shelters, mountains that became temporary islands. Scientists studying ancient geology in North America have found evidence of massive floods, such as those caused by the sudden release of glacial lakes during the end of the last ice age. These floods were so large that they carved immense channels into the land, formed new rivers, and reshaped terrain in ways visible even today. In South America, the pattern continues. Many early cultures, including those in the Amazon basin and the Andes, passed down stories of floods that covered their world. Some speak of a few survivors, some describe warnings, some mention unusual signs in the sky before the waters rose. Though expressed differently, the narrative structure remains consistent. Overwhelming water, sudden change, and memory preserved for future generations. In the Pacific Islands, flood stories often involve moving to new islands or escaping rising seas. Communities across Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia have memories of water overtaking land, forcing them to leave their homes. These cultures depended on keen environmental awareness, and the stories they preserved often include details about changing sea levels, storm surges, and catastrophic waves. Scientists studying the region have noted that sea levels changed dramatically as the last ice age ended, and that low-lying islands were submerged or reshaped. These changes could explain why so many flood memories persist across the Pacific. In northern Europe, some early stories describe floods associated with the shaping of the land after glaciers retreated. The myths preserved in Norse traditions include references to waters covering the earth before land reappeared, an idea that aligns with geological evidence from the region. Taken together, these stories form a global pattern. They come from environments as different as river valleys, coastal regions, mountain ranges, and island chains. Yet they all describe events on an enormous scale. This suggests that early humans lived through periods of significant disruption caused by rapid changes in water levels. But what caused these events? Modern science offers several possible explanations, ranging from the melting of ice sheets to shifts in rainfall patterns, volcanic activity, and earthquakes disrupting coastlines. However, some researchers have explored another possibility, that a rare celestial event might have influenced Earth's climate or oceans in ways that triggered large-scale floods. This is where the memory of a crossing world becomes relevant. If ancient people saw an unusual object in the sky before major floods occurred, the association between the two could have persisted long after the event itself faded from direct memory. While it's difficult to determine exactly what ancient people saw, their stories consistently link unusual celestial behaviour with environmental changes. Not all floods were global, of course. Many were regional, but large enough to feel world-ending to the people affected. Yet the global consistency of the flood narrative suggests that multiple regions experienced major water-related disasters around the same general time period, likely during the long transition out of the last ice age. Sea levels rose rapidly during this period, by nearly 120 metres overall, with several sudden surges lasting decades or centuries. These surges were large enough to submerge coastlines, flood entire regions, and force migrations across continents. Archaeologists studying ancient shorelines have found evidence of settlements now underwater, some located miles off modern coasts. These settlements would have been lost quickly as oceans rose, leaving communities with little time to adapt. This kind of widespread change would not have gone unnoticed. It would have transformed hunting grounds, destroyed farmland, displaced animals, and forced humans to relocate. Those who survived would have carried the memories with them, embedding them into stories that served both as warning and explanation. Another factor to consider is that early human populations were smaller and more interconnected within their regions. When a major flooding event happened, it often affected everyone. Entire communities experienced the disaster together. This collective memory made the story stronger, more durable, and more likely to survive through oral tradition. In places like Mesopotamia, river flooding was already a major part of life, but ancient layers of sediment show periods where flooding was far more intense than usual. These periods align with times of climate instability and could have contributed to the development of major flood narratives. When people rebuilt their lives after these disasters, they placed great importance on remembering. Memory became a survival tool. If such an event happened once, it could happen again. Stories served as warnings, education, and identity. And because the memories were so powerful, they persisted long after the original causes were forgotten. In many cultures, these stories eventually took on layers of religious meaning. Deities were woven into them. Moral lessons were added. Symbolism developed. But the underlying structure remained grounded in real events. The emotional weight of surviving a flood was far greater than any symbolic embellishment added later. The core of the story was always the same. The water rose higher than anyone had seen. The land changed. The world felt new after the waters receded. One of the most striking aspects of these stories is their balance of detail and simplicity. They focus on the essentials: water rising, people fleeing, survival against the odds, and the eventual return of dry land. These details appear again and again across cultures, suggesting that the memory of catastrophic flooding may have been deeply imprinted in the collective mind of humanity. What the ancient flood stories show is not the imagination of disconnected cultures, but the shared memory of a species that lived through dramatic environmental changes. These memories shaped the earliest human traditions, influenced settlement patterns, and became foundational stories in many religions. They also remind us how closely our ancestors watched the world around them, how carefully they observed changes in the sky and sea, and how seriously they took their responsibility to remember. As we continue, we move from these memories of rising waters to the question of why these events were so widespread, and what role, if any, an unusual celestial visitor might have played in shaping the floods that civilizations refused to forget. The next part explores how researchers began comparing ancient accounts with geological and astronomical evidence, following the threads that connect myth, memory, and the possibility of a world that crossed paths with Earth. When people today imagine ancient astronomers, they often think of quiet figures standing on rooftops or temple platforms, gazing upward with an expression of calm certainty. But the truth is more practical. These early observers were not detached from the world. They were deeply involved in the daily survival of their communities. Their work allowed societies to plant at the right time, prepare for floods, predict seasonal changes, and navigate long distances. Astronomy wasn't a specialized hobby. It was a core element of how civilizations functioned. The stars were a map. The planets were markers. The moon was a dependable timer. And anything unusual in the sky was something to pay attention to because unusual events could signal unusual times. It was in this careful environment of observation that ancient astronomers first began to record more than predictable cycles. They noted the wandering stars, the planets, whose paths drifted from the fixed star background. They tracked eclipses, comets, novas, and irregularities in the night sky. Every deviation had meaning, and when something appeared that didn't fit the familiar patterns, they didn't forget it, they wrote it down. This is where the earliest tablets become important. In Mesopotamia, scribes used clay to preserve knowledge in a durable, permanent form. These tablets recorded everything from trade transactions to hymns to astronomical observations. Many of the most intriguing texts belong to a series known as the Astronomical diaries, which record daily sky conditions over centuries. These diaries contain routine descriptions, planetary positions, cloud cover, notable events, but they also include references to unusual objects. Among these objects are references that some scholars have interpreted as early attempts to describe a body with irregular movement. The term Nibiru appears in some texts associated with a crossing point or a celestial object that transitions between sky regions. These references have been debated extensively, but they all share one feature, the idea of motion that stands out. To early astronomers, anything that moved differently from the known planets required classification. They didn't always have the vocabulary to describe these objects precisely. They used the terms available to them, which sometimes led to multiple interpretations. But the persistence of a word like Nibiru across different periods suggests that the term meant something important. It was not a casual label. It carried meaning shaped by observation and tradition. Modern researchers examining these tablets have found that Nibiru's meaning shifts depending on the time period. In some cases, it refers to a star connected to seasonal markers. In others, it seems linked to Jupiter. In a few, it appears to represent a body whose motion is tied to the idea of crossing. This inconsistency doesn't weaken the concept. It suggests the term was flexible enough to describe more than one thing, while still maintaining its core association with transition. If ancient observers saw an object with an extremely long orbit, it would have been difficult to track consistently. It might have appeared only once every few hundred or thousand years, bright enough to be noticed only during part of its path. Such rare events could inspire stories and warnings that endured long after the object itself disappeared from view. When another generation saw something similar, they might connect it to the stories of their ancestors and give it the same name or assign it a similar meaning. This process of linking new observations to old memories is one reason why ancient texts are such valuable sources. They reveal how early astronomers interpreted celestial events through the lens of their inherited knowledge. They also show that unusual objects in the sky were not dismissed or forgotten. They were recorded with care. In Babylon, astronomical schools developed complex methods for tracking celestial cycles. They created star lists, ephemerides, and predictions. Their work was mathematical, systematic, and in many cases surprisingly accurate. When something unusual happened, like the appearance of a bright new star, the record of it was included in the tablets. In some years, these unusual events are described alongside reports of environmental disruption, such as heavy rainfall, floods, or failed crops. While correlation does not equal causation, these pairings demonstrate that ancient observers saw the sky and the land as interconnected parts of the same system. In Egypt, astronomical records were tied to religion and governance. Priests tracked the heliacal rising of stars to predict the flooding of the Nile. They built temples aligned with celestial events. Their star maps contain references to unusual objects as well, though fewer than the Mesopotamian texts. Still, the broad pattern remains. When the sky changed unexpectedly, people took note. In China, early astronomers observed comets, novas, and other irregular sky events with a degree of precision unmatched by many other cultures. Their records include references to guest stars that appeared suddenly and faded. Some of these records correspond to known supernovae. Others describe objects whose identity remains unclear. These observers also linked sky irregularities with earthly consequences. A strange object could signify a coming change, whether social, political, or environmental. If a long-orbiting object entered the inner solar system during this time, it would have been visible across many regions. If it appeared slowly, brightened over time, and moved against the star background in an unfamiliar way, astronomers would have tracked it carefully. Even if they didn't know what it was, they would have recorded its presence. And if significant natural disasters followed its appearance, the association might have taken root. Archaeological discoveries have revealed that many early cultures had more sophisticated astronomical knowledge than previously believed. Stone structures in Neolithic Europe align with solstices and equinoxes. Sites in South America, such as Chanquillo, appear to be ancient solar observatories. Polynesian navigators memorized hundreds of star positions. The Maya developed detailed calendars based on observed cycles. These examples show that early humans took astronomy seriously everywhere on Earth. If a wandering planet, or any large celestial object, passed close enough to be seen, it would have been noticed by these communities. And because knowledge travelled through trade, migration and storytelling, the memory of it could have spread widely. People might not have agreed on the object's exact nature, but the event itself would have left a mark on their records. Modern astronomers studying the distant solar system have found evidence that large objects may exist far beyond the orbit of Neptune. Some of these hypothetical bodies follow elongated orbits that take thousands of years to complete. These objects are difficult to detect, even with modern instruments. If one such object had moved closer to the Sun in the past, its appearance could have been brief and its path unique enough to confuse early observers. This possibility does not confirm the ancient references, but it makes it reasonable to consider how a rare event might influence ancient records. Another fact to keep in mind is that ancient astronomers sometimes describe the same object differently, depending on its position in the sky. If an object appeared near the Sun at one time and near a constellation at another, it might receive different labels. This could explain some of the inconsistency in the tablets. They were describing what they saw from the ground, using terminology tied to their culture and cosmology. The idea of a wandering planet becomes especially interesting when placed alongside ancient flood counts. Many cultures connect unusual sky behaviour with environmental change. Sometimes this appears in symbolic language. Other times, the connection is more direct. The records do not prove that a celestial event caused the floods recorded in myth, but they do show that ancient people believed the sky could influence the land. This belief was not irrational. Comets can be associated with meteor showers. Eclipses can cause temporary darkness. Large volcanic eruptions can darken the sky for months. Climate events can be influenced by solar cycles. The link between the heavens and earthly conditions was not purely symbolic. It came from observation. Some ancient tablets describe periods of unusual weather following unusual celestial events. These descriptions often appear in administrative records rather than mythic texts, which suggests the observations were practical, not symbolic. If a strange object appeared overhead and crops failed the following season, astronomers noted both events. They didn't need to understand the mechanism, they only needed to record the pattern. As centuries passed, these patterns shaped the stories cultures told. Myths emerged not out of fantasy, but out of attempts to make sense of real experiences. This blending of observation and storytelling is how the memory of a wandering planet may have become connected to the memory of great floods. While the term Nibiru evolved, its association with crossing and transition persisted. Some scholars interpret this crossing as a reference to the solstice point or to the equinox. Others see it as a more literal description of an object crossing sky regions. The ambiguity leaves room for interpretation. But what matters more than the exact definition is the persistence of the concept. People continue to use the term across centuries. They used it to describe important celestial conditions. They used it in context related to change. This persistence suggests that even if Nibiru referred to different objects at different times, the underlying idea of a wandering or crossing body was familiar to ancient astronomers. It was not an invented idea. It was part of their framework for understanding the sky. In modern times, researchers studying these tablets look for patterns. They compare astronomical records to geological evidence. They examine ancient climate data alongside written histories. They look for overlaps between celestial events and environmental disruptions. This interdisciplinary approach doesn't prove the existence of a wandering planet, but it gives space to consider how celestial events might influence Earth systems. If an object with enough mass passed near Earth, even without colliding, its gravitational influence could affect tides, climate patterns, or volcanic activity. These effects would not be immediate or uniform. They would vary depending on the distance, the speed of the object, and Earth's position relative to it. Ancient people wouldn't have understood these dynamics, but they would have experienced the outcomes. When modern astronomers attempt to reconstruct the history of the solar system, they consider many possibilities. Some models include large objects being ejected or captured. Some involve long-period bodies that rarely venture near the Sun. If such objects existed, some might have been observed by ancient sky watchers. Even if those observations were rare, they could have left a mark on early astronomical traditions. This blending of tablets, observation, memory, and myth is part of why the search for a wandering planet continues to fascinate researchers, not because the ancient texts provide definitive proof, but because they offer clues about how early humans interacted with the world above them. These clues encourage modern thinkers to consider possibilities beyond the familiar. As we move forward, we begin to see how these ancient observations intersect with scientific models of large-scale environmental change. The next part explores how gravitational forces, orbital mechanics, and Earth's delicate systems might respond to the presence of a massive body passing through the solar system. This brings us closer to understanding how the memory of a flood and the memory of a wandering world might have become intertwined in the stories the ancients refused to forget. When people hear the idea that a passing world might influence the Earth, their minds often jump to dramatic images of collisions, fire, or sudden destruction. But the science behind gravitational interaction is far more subtle and far more patient. Cosmic forces don't need explosions or impacts to reshape a planet. They only need mass, distance, and time. And in the long history of the solar system, objects have passed near our world often enough that astronomers today can trace the fingerprints of ancient encounters in the motions of planets, the tilt of axes, the behaviours of comets, and the patterns left in the outer solar debris fields. If a large wandering planet ever moved through the inner solar system, even briefly, its influence wouldn't have needed to be violent. It could have been quiet, slow, gradual at first, but powerful enough to disrupt Earth's balance of water, climate, ice, and seasonal rhythms. The question, then, isn't whether a passing world could stir the seas. The question is how such an event would unfold, what mechanisms would be involved, and whether the effects would be large enough for ancient humans to witness and remember. To explore that, we need to look closely at the mechanics of gravitational influence. Not the dramatic kind from movies, but the real kind that shapes tides every day. The Moon, small compared to Earth, manages to move entire oceans through tidal forces. It doesn't collide with anything. It doesn't need to. Its gravity pulls on the oceans, lifts them and shifts them, creating waves that wrap around continents. Now imagine something larger, much larger than our Moon, something closer to the size of the outer planets, or even a small gas giant. If such a body came near Earth, not close enough to hit, just close enough to exert a noticeable pull, the oceans would respond immediately. Tides would increase, coastal regions would see water levels rise, storm surges would gain strength. Even if the object moved quickly, its influence would still leave a mark. A passing planet doesn't need to be extremely close to have an effect. The Moon is about 380,000 kilometres away, and still exerts enough gravitational pull to lift oceans by several feet. A planet several times more massive than the Moon, passing even at a greater distance, could alter tides on a scale far larger than anything humans have recorded in modern times. But tides aren't the only thing that would shift. Earth's rotation could be altered slightly. A change in rotation speed or axis tilt, even a small one, would produce large-scale consequences. Seasons could shift abruptly. Weather patterns could change. Ice sheets could destabilize. A rapid change in temperature or pressure systems could lead to intense storms or prolonged rainfall. And when atmospheric circulation patterns change on a global scale, entire climates can be reshaped. If such a sequence of events happened thousands of years ago, people living at the time wouldn't have understood the mechanics behind it. They wouldn't have known about orbital calculations or axial tilt, but they would have seen the skies change. They would have seen clouds gathering in unfamiliar formations. They would have felt temperature shifts, winds that didn't behave normally, and rain patterns that didn't follow seasonal expectations. And if the effects were strong enough, they would have watched rivers swell, lakes overflow, and coastlines recede beneath rising waters. Something else to consider is the effect on tectonics. The Earth's crust floats on molten layers that respond to pressure changes. A large gravitational influence could place new stresses on tectonic plates. Those stresses, combined with pre-existing weaknesses, might trigger earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or sudden release events like glacial outbursts. These eruptions could melt ice rapidly or change the flow of rivers. When an entire system is delicately balanced, even a small external push can trigger a cascade. Modern scientists have studied how gravitational interactions shape the outer solar system. They found patterns showing that objects billions of kilometers away can influence one another. Large bodies can shepherd smaller ones, redirect comet paths, and even eject objects entirely from the solar system. These effects don't require impacts. They require mass and time. In the inner solar system, the gravitational balances are tighter. The planets move in stable orbits, but those orbits were shaped by billions of years of interactions. If, at any point in the past, an object with a highly elongated orbit came through the region, passing between Mars and Earth or beyond Earth's orbit, the effects could be measurable. Today, computational models of early solar system formation suggest that several large bodies may have roamed the early system before settling or being ejected. Some of these bodies might have crossed Earth's path at distances close enough to influence climate or water systems. One commonly studied example is the Younger Dryas period, a sudden cooling event that occurred at the end of the last ice age. Researchers still debate its cause, but one possibility involves disruptions to ocean currents. These disruptions may have been triggered by sudden fresh water release from glacial lakes. Something needed to destabilize these ice systems. It could have been climate fluctuation. It could have been Earth's own internal processes. But some scientists have explored external triggers as well, including the influence of a passing body. If an object approached the solar system on a long, slow orbit, spending most of its time far from the Sun, it might pass unnoticed for centuries. When it finally came close enough to be visible, ancient astronomers would have taken note. Its movement would have been slow compared to meteors and comets. It wouldn't streak across the sky. It would drift. And that slow, steady drift would have been far more unsettling than a fast event. People feared what lingered. If communities had seen such an object during a period of environmental instability, the connection would have been unforgettable. Entire coastlines could change within a generation. Islands could disappear. River valleys could flood permanently. Ancient people living through such events would not have needed exact astronomical knowledge to feel the link. They would have seen something new in the sky, something that didn't behave like familiar stars or planets, and associated it with the upheaval unfolding around them. Now, consider how ancient people described large-scale environmental change. They didn't have terms like climate shift or orbital influence. They described what they saw: water rising, rivers breaking their boundaries, storms that lasted too long, and rains that didn't follow predictable cycles. Their descriptions focused on experience, not mechanism. Over time, as these memories were passed from generation to generation, the cause and effect may have become woven together. A wandering object in the sky could easily become part of the story explaining the flood. It's important to note that ancient flood stories rarely describe gentle or gradual events. They describe suddenness, rapid change, water rising faster than expected. Faster. If a passing world could cause tidal amplification, storm intensification, or atmospheric imbalance, the resulting flood would not resemble normal seasonal behaviour. It would resemble the stories we read in ancient texts. One scenario scientists have explored involves tidal resonance. If the gravitational pull of a passing body synchronized with certain oceanic cycles, it could amplify waves beyond ordinary levels. This effect is similar to how pushing a swing at the right moment increases its height. In oceans, resonance can create massive surges, especially in enclosed basins or areas where geography funnels water into narrow spaces. Another relevant factor is Earth's axial precession. If a passing body altered the tilt even slightly, the distribution of solar energy across the planet would change. Ice sheets would either melt or grow depending on the direction of the tilt change. Rapid melting could unleash enormous amounts of water in a short period. Ancient humans witnessing this wouldn't have understood precession or tilt, but they would have understood that the world was changing in ways they had never experienced. Another possibility involves triggering glacial lake outburst floods. Throughout the end of the last ice age, massive lakes formed along retreating glaciers. These lakes were held in place by walls of ice or loose debris. A small change in pressure or temperature could cause these walls to rupture, releasing enormous volumes of water. If a gravitational shift destabilized ice structures even slightly, it could have caused multiple outbursts across different regions. The combined effect would have been catastrophic for communities living downstream. Scientists studying ancient sediment cores have found layers of material indicating rapid flooding across several regions around the same periods. These layers often appear alongside evidence of climate instability. The pattern suggests that ancient people experienced more than one localized flood. They experienced clusters of large-scale events happening close enough in time to form a global memory. Even today, scientists acknowledge that water systems can respond dramatically to small shifts in Earth's internal or external conditions. A slight change in sea surface temperature can influence hurricanes. A small shift in atmospheric pressure can alter rainfall patterns across continents. If these sensitive systems encountered a new gravitational force, the consequences would be noticeable. In addition to physical changes, a passing body could influence Earth's magnetic field. The magnetic field is generated by the motion of molten iron in the core. External gravitational forces can influence this motion subtly. A shift in the magnetic field could allow more solar radiation to reach the planet temporarily, affecting temperatures, winds, and weather systems. Ancient humans wouldn't have known anything about geomagnetism. They would have noticed only the visible effects: stronger storms, unusual skies, and water behaving unpredictably. Modern scientists also study how orbital resonances shape planetary systems. When two bodies move in synchronized orbital patterns, even briefly they can exchange energy. Earth's orbit could be affected by a passing world through such interactions. A small change in orbit could change how much sunlight Earth receives over time. These subtle shifts can lead to climate fluctuations. A period of strong warming or strong cooling could destabilize ice sheets and alter rainfall patterns enough to produce floods. All of these mechanisms demonstrate that a passing world doesn't need to collide with Earth to influence it. Gravity doesn't need permission. It simply acts wherever mass exists. And if ancient people saw a large object in the sky during a period of environmental upheaval, the connection between the two would have become part of their stories. These stories were passed down because they held practical significance. Communities needed to remember the events. They needed to learn what signs to watch for. If an unusual object appeared in the sky again, those memories could help them prepare. Over time, the details changed. The object gained names, meanings, and roles shaped by the culture telling the story. But the core idea remained. Something passed overhead, and the world changed. As we move forward, we step from the scientific possibilities to the human experiences connected with them. In the next part, we follow how people across different regions preserved memories of survivors, those who climbed mountains, built vessels, or found refuge as the waters rose, and how these accounts add another layer to the possibility that a wandering world influenced the floods that civilizations refuse to forget. When people think about the Earth, they often imagine a solid, steady planet where continents sit firmly in place and oceans follow simple rhythms. But the Earth beneath our feet is never still, and the oceans that surround every landmass are always in motion. Beneath the calm surface of daily life, forces on enormous scales shape the world slowly, quietly, and sometimes violently. These forces are always at work, but every so often something disrupts them. That disruption can come from within the Earth, from changes in the atmosphere, or from interactions with the gravitational pull of celestial bodies. And when those disruptions reach a certain threshold, the waters of the world respond. Understanding how oceans can rise, shift, overflow, or reshape entire regions means looking at several interconnected systems. The Earth's crust, the movement of its tectonic plates, the behavior of its tides, and the circulation of water across the globe all affect how stable the environment is. These systems are sensitive enough that small changes can create large consequences. If an external influence adds pressure, something like a gravitational pull from a passing planetary body, the effects can amplify in ways that feel sudden, intense, and unforgettable. To understand this interplay, start with the tectonic plates. The Earth's crust is not one solid piece. It is divided into large plates that float on top of a shifting molten layer beneath. These plates move slowly, often only a few centimeters a year, but their motion shapes mountains, valleys, ocean basins, and coastlines. When one plate pushes against another, the Earth bends or breaks. This can create earthquakes, volcanic activity, or sudden releases of pressure that affect entire regions. These movements have happened for millions of years, but when something disturbs the balance, the effects can accelerate. A gravitational pull from a large external object, even if exerted at a distance, could influence the stresses on the crust. It wouldn't need to be dramatic. A slight increase in stress on areas already close to breaking could trigger earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. Ancient people living through these events would not have known the cause. They would only have seen the outcomes: land shaking, mountains erupting, and waters responding. Some ancient stories describe events where the land seemed to collapse or shift before the floods came. These accounts often appear alongside descriptions of strange signs in the sky. It is not difficult to imagine how people connected these events. If the Earth shook and the skies changed at the same time, the experience would have felt linked. Even today, scientists examine how seismic activity influences water systems. A large earthquake can trigger tsunamis, change groundwater flow, alter the shape of riverbeds, or disturb layers of ice that hold back glacial lakes. Now consider the tides. The moon controls most of Earth's tidal motion. Its gravitational pull lifts the oceans as the Earth rotates, creating predictable cycles. But the tides are also influenced by the sun. When the Earth, sun, and moon align, tides become stronger, creating what are known as spring tides. When they form right angles, tides weaken. This is normal. But imagine adding a third gravitational influence, something large enough to interact with the tides. A visiting planetary body would not need to approach extremely close to exert a noticeable effect. Its gravity could increase tidal heights by several meters or more, depending on mass and distance. This kind of shift would be most visible in coastal regions, where even small increases in sea level can cause flooding. If these shifts happened over days or weeks, the changes in water behavior would seem unpredictable and dangerous. Ancient coastal peoples would have seen tides they had never experienced before. Fishing villages, river settlements, and port communities could have been overwhelmed without warning. The Earth's rotation also shapes the tides. A slight change in rotation speed could alter how water moves across the planet. If something interacted with Earth strongly enough to slow or speed its rotation even slightly, the tides could behave differently. Storm surges could become more powerful. Water could pile up along certain coastlines. In extreme cases, the redistribution of water could feel like the ocean itself was moving in ways that defied normal experience. Ocean currents play another role. These currents are driven by temperature differences, salinity, and the rotation of the Earth. The Gulf Stream, for example, carries warm water across the Atlantic and influences the climate of entire continents. If a gravitational influence altered winds, temperature patterns, or the rotation of the planet, the currents could shift. A shift in ocean circulation can trigger abrupt climate changes. Scientists believe that at the end of the last ice age, changes in ocean currents helped cause periods of sudden warming and cooling. These changes destabilize large ice sheets, leading to rapid influxes of fresh water into the oceans. Freshwater influxes are important here because they can raise sea levels very quickly. When large glacial lakes burst, the volume of water released can be enormous. These events are called glacial lake outburst floods, and they can send water surging across large regions in a short time. If a gravitational shift or increased seismic activity weakened the ice holding these lakes in place, multiple outbursts could occur in close succession. The combined effect could create regional floods large enough to be remembered for generations. Another element to consider is sea level rise during the end of the last ice age. As global temperatures increased, ice sheets covering North America, Europe, and parts of Asia melted. This melting caused sea levels to rise more than 100 meters over several thousand years. But this rise did not happen smoothly. There were periods when sea levels increased very rapidly, sometimes several meters within a few decades. People living in coastal regions would have seen their landscapes swallowed, their homes lost, and their histories erased by the advancing sea. These changes were not uniform across the world. Some areas experienced dramatic local changes far more quickly than global averages. River deltas collapsed, coastal plains flooded, islands vanished beneath rising seas. These events must have left deep impressions on the people who witnessed them. It makes sense that these memories survived, transformed into stories that warned future generations about the power of water. Now consider the possibility that a passing world could amplify these already fragile systems. If Earth was already undergoing climate shifts, melting ice, and unstable water patterns, the gravitational pull of a nearby planetary body could push it past a tipping point. The result would not necessarily be a single global flood. It could be a series of regional disasters occurring close enough together in time for ancient people to remember them as a single event. Water levels rising in Mesopotamia could coincide with floods in the Indus Valley, storms in the Mediterranean, coastal changes in Southeast Asia, and disruptions across the Americas. To ancient people with limited knowledge of distant regions, these separate events could easily blend into the memory of one extraordinary flood. Even today, cultures that had no contact with each other preserve strikingly similar descriptions of water covering the land, people fleeing to higher ground, and the world restarting after the waters recede. Tectonic activity can also change coastlines abruptly. When earthquakes strike underwater, they can lift or lower sections of land. This can create tsunamis or change the shape of bays and estuaries. If multiple tectonic events happened around the same period, possibly influenced by external gravitational forces, the combined effect could reshape coastal geography dramatically. People living at the time might have experienced sudden changes to their shorelines, large waves, and unpredictable tides, all the elements found in ancient stories of the Great Flood. Volcanic activity adds another layer. Large eruptions can melt snow and ice quickly, releasing water into rivers. They can also cause temporary cooling by sending ash into the atmosphere. Cooling can lead to increased glaciation, but if conditions shift again because of atmospheric changes or gravitational influence, those new ice formations could melt rapidly, adding more water to rising seas. Ancient stories sometimes mention darkness, unusual skies, or periods when the sun behaved strangely. These details might reflect volcanic eruptions occurring during the same period as massive flooding. Even small changes in Earth's orbit can influence climate cycles. Every few tens of thousands of years, Earth's orbit becomes slightly more or less elliptical. These changes, known as Milankovitch cycles, affect how much sunlight each hemisphere receives. They contribute to ice ages and warm periods. If a passing world altered Earth's orbit slightly, the effect could be enough to destabilize existing climate patterns. Ancient astronomers who noticed an unusual object in the sky might have linked its appearance to the environmental changes their communities were experiencing. Modern science has revealed that Earth's climate system can respond rapidly to small changes. Ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica show that temperatures have risen or fallen by several degrees in just a decade during certain periods of the past. These shifts can influence rainfall, ocean currents, ice melt, and vegetation patterns. If ancient humans lived through one of these rapid transitions, the experience would have felt catastrophic. Combined with tidal amplification or tectonic disturbances, the effect could have been overwhelming. In some regions, archaeological evidence reveals layers of sudden flooding followed by long periods of abandonment. Settlements in ancient Mesopotamia show signs of silt deposition across large areas, suggesting that floods were not only frequent but sometimes devastating. Similar evidence exists in the Indus Valley, in southeastern Europe, in parts of China, and in coastal South America. Each region has its own explanation, but the pattern is global. Periods of environmental instability marked by water rising in unexpected ways. When ancient people attempted to record these events, they used the tools they had. They described the waters rising. They described the ground shaking. They described seeing something unusual in the sky. These records, preserved in myths, stories, and fragments of early writing, provide a human perspective on events that modern science is only now beginning to understand. The Earth, shaped by tectonics, tides, and climate cycles, responds to external influences in complex ways. It is not surprising that ancient people living through these events connected them to unusual celestial sightings. They didn't have our scientific vocabulary. They didn't need it. They observed the world as it behaved, and they remembered. As we continue, the next part traces how survivors across different regions preserved stories of refuge, accounts of those who climbed hills, retreated to mountains, built vessels, or followed instinct to escape the rising waters, and how these memories provide yet another layer in understanding why the Great Flood became one of humanity's most enduring stories. When people tell stories about surviving great disasters, they often focus on the places where the last few members of a community found safety. In the accounts of ancient floods, those places are almost always the highest points of land. Mountains, ridges, plateaus, islands that rose above the rest, or natural shelters formed by the shape of the terrain. Across the world, cultures separated by oceans and vast distances describe the same image. People climbing upward, away from water that rose too fast for ordinary escape. These stories are not gentle tales. They come from moments when entire landscapes changed. Rivers broke their boundaries, coastlines shifted, and the people who managed to survive carried the memory forward with the clarity that comes from living through something life-altering. What makes these accounts especially striking is how universal they are. From South America to Asia, from the Pacific Islands to Northern Europe, from Africa to North America, communities remember ascending to high ground while the world below disappeared underwater. In some regions, the details are surprisingly specific. In others, the stories are simple, focusing on a group of people climbing a hill or mountain as the waters approached. But the essence remains the same. Survival came from going upward, and those who made it passed down their experiences so the next generations would understand the power of the event. When we look at these stories side by side, a global pattern takes shape, not because one culture borrowed from another, but because people across the world experienced similar events. Their memories formed independently, yet the structure of the stories matches so consistently that it becomes difficult to dismiss them as coincidence. In the Andes, people remember a flood that rose so quickly that only a few escaped by climbing the mountains. These accounts appear in multiple indigenous traditions across the region. Some describe a warning delivered by a traveller or a guiding spirit. Others describe the land shaking before the waters came. The survivors watched as entire valleys filled, and when the waters finally receded, they believed the world had been reborn. Their descendants preserved these memories through oral tradition, long before Europeans arrived. Far to the north, in what is now Alaska and Canada, indigenous peoples also tell of massive floods. Some describe ocean waters rushing far inland. Others speak of ice breaking apart and releasing floods so large that only those who climbed high ground survived. These stories sometimes mention unusual skies or strange signs that preceded the flood. They are not vague suggestions of high water. They are detailed accounts of rapid, intense events that left lasting impressions on the ancestors of the people who still live there. In the Pacific Northwest, stories describe the land shaking violently before the waters surged. Some mention hills becoming islands. Others describe animals fleeing alongside people as the waters rose. These accounts often include the same emphasis on climbing. The people who lived there remembered which hills saved their ancestors and pointed to them as proof that the story was real. Across the Pacific Ocean, island cultures also maintain memories of rising seas. In Polynesia, stories tell of islands disappearing beneath the waves. Communities escaped to higher islands or climbed inland hills. Even on volcanic islands with limited high ground, people described finding safety on elevated ridges. These memories align with what scientists know about sea level rise in the region. Entire islands from Southeast Asia to the far-flung Pacific were submerged as the last ice age ended. The people living there had no choice but to move. Their stories reflect the urgency of these migrations. In Australia, Aboriginal groups have stories older than many written civilizations. Some of these stories describe coastlines that existed thousands of years ago, coastlines that are now underwater. These stories often describe rising seas that forced communities to retreat to higher land. Modern oceanographic studies reveal that the details match places now submerged far offshore, suggesting that these ancient memories preserve events from more than 7,000 years ago. In South Asia, early communities preserved memories of floods that left entire regions uninhabitable. Some of these stories describe survivors fleeing to elevated areas where they waited for the waters to subside. Archaeologists exploring the region have found evidence of settlements buried under layers of silt, while other settlements show signs of abrupt abandonment. These findings match the oral traditions that speak of sudden, intense water surges. In the Middle East, mountain refuges also appear in multiple traditions. The story from Mesopotamia describes survivors resting on a mountain after the waters receded. This detail appears in the oldest versions of the narrative, long before any religious texts were written. In nearby regions, similar stories mention hills or mountains that protected the ancestors from the flood. These accounts were not symbolic. They were references to places the people knew. In Europe, some early traditions tell of water covering lowlands and people escaping to high ground. In parts of Scandinavia, stories about a world covered by water and then restored appear in early myths. These memories may reflect the rapid sea level rise that transformed northern Europe's coastline after the retreat of massive ice sheets. In Africa, different cultures preserve memories of floods that reshaped their world. In some cases, the stories focus on rivers that overflowed with unusual force. In others, communities describe water rising over plains that are now far from the sea. These accounts frequently mention people fleeing to elevated regions, sometimes describing specific hills or mountains where their ancestors survived. These global similarities suggest a deeper reality. People across the world lived through large floods and remembered how they escaped. Their stories emphasize survival, not imagination. And one of the most important details is always the same. They climbed. Climbing to survive a flood makes intuitive sense. Water seeks low places. High ground offers safety. When floodwaters rise faster than people expect, uphill becomes the only direction left. But what makes these legends significant is not the climbing itself. It is the scale and suddenness described in the stories. In many accounts, the speed of the rising water is emphasized. People describe it coming too fast for ordinary responses. Rivers overflowed more rapidly than usual. Seas surged without warning. The floodwaters did not behave like seasonal flooding. They behaved like something triggered by a system pushed far out of balance. By comparing these legends from around the world, historians and scientists gain insight into how ancient people responded to environmental change. When these stories describe surviving on mountaintops, the implication is that the flooding was widespread and intense. In many cases, the stories include details about animals climbing alongside humans. These details show that survival was not limited to people with specific roles or knowledge. Entire groups responded instinctively to the rising water. Some stories describe people building vessels. These do not always resemble large ships. Sometimes they are rafts, canoes, or makeshift shelters used to ride the flood. Other accounts describe people clinging to trees or floating debris. In all of these stories, the common theme is that people were reacting to an event that felt overwhelming. Not all survivors fled to mountains. Some communities lived near hills, ridges, or rock formations that became temporary islands during flooding. These locations became sacred. People pointed to them as proof that their ancestors had lived through something extraordinary. In many regions, these places are still recognized today. Archaeologists studying them often find evidence of ancient habitation or ritual activity, suggesting that the stories were not exaggerated. In several cultures, elders designated certain mountains as the ones where people gathered during the flood. These mountains were not chosen at random. They were often the highest in the region, or the most central. In some traditions, every generation learned the name of the mountain where their ancestors survived. This practice created continuity between past and present. The mountain served as both a physical landmark and a reminder of what had happened. In parts of Asia and Africa, some communities performed ceremonies on mountaintops to honour the memory of the survivors. These ceremonies were not invented without cause. They were meant to preserve the knowledge that the high places once saved their people. Even today, some of these traditions continue in modified forms. What makes these patterns especially compelling is how they align with scientific research into ancient sea level rise. After the last ice age ended, sea levels rose dramatically, sometimes by meters within a few decades. When ice sheets collapsed, they released enormous volumes of water into the oceans. These events were not uniform. Some regions experienced sharp increases, while others saw more gradual changes. But many places experienced sudden floods powerful enough to leave a mark on the landscape and on human memory. For example, the collapse of glacial lakes in North America caused floods that carved massive pathways through the land. The people living in those regions witnessed water moving in ways that had no precedent. They preserved the memory of these events through stories passed down for thousands of years. In southern Asia, similar glacial lake bursts affected river systems. The people living there experienced sudden floods that transformed valleys. The survivors retreated to higher ground, and their stories reflect these experiences. Even in the Mediterranean, archaeological evidence shows that some coastal settlements were abandoned at the same time sea levels surged. These events would have been traumatic for the people who lived there. They would have carried the memory of displacement and survival with them. The global nature of these stories suggests that the end of the last ice age was not a purely geological event. It was a human experience. It was lived, witnessed, and remembered. And when the waters rose too quickly, people responded by climbing. Those who made it to high places became the ancestors of the communities who preserved the stories. But something else stands out in these accounts. Many of them mention unusual skies or strange celestial events before the flood. Sometimes the descriptions are vague, sometimes they are detailed. People speak of objects glowing in the sky, stars moving strangely, or lights that behave differently from anything they had seen before. These details tie the stories to the earlier narrative of a wandering world or unusual celestial phenomena. At the time, people had no scientific framework to explain what they saw. They connected the events directly. Something changed in the sky. Then the water rose. Modern researchers exploring ancient climate change have considered how external gravitational forces could destabilize ice sheets, accelerate sea level rise, or trigger massive storms. If such an influence occurred during a period when the Earth's systems were already vulnerable, the effects could have been catastrophic. To early humans, this would have felt like the world itself was shifting. The people who survived these events became the storytellers. They described the shock of seeing familiar places disappear underwater. They described the journey upward. They described how the land changed once the waters finally receded. These stories evolved over time. Some gained symbolic meaning. Some became infused with religious significance. Some remained simple accounts passed down through generations. No matter what shape they took, they preserved the memory of survival, and in every region, the survivors remembered the mountain tops. As we continue, we follow how these survival stories form the backbone of cultural identity, and how the memory of unusual celestial events alongside them deepened the belief that the flood had a cause beyond weather or chance. The next part explores how ancient traditions linked the event to beings, forces, or figures that seem to stand between humanity and the heavens. When people today hear the word Anunnaki, they often think of something distant, mysterious, or larger than life. But to the earliest people who carved their stories into clay, the Anunnaki were not distant at all. They were woven into the fabric of how the world worked. They were the beings who decided when kings ruled, who watched over cities, who governed the line between order and chaos, and who appeared in the background of nearly every major story about how the world began, how civilization started, and how disasters reshaped the land. To understand how the Anunnaki became connected to the Great Flood, it helps to step into the mindset of the ancient world. The earliest humans lived in landscapes full of uncertainty. Rivers rose, crops failed, storms arrived without warning, and when the earth changed suddenly, something had to explain it. The Anunnaki filled that role. They were the ones who understood forces too large for ordinary people to grasp. In the oldest texts, the Anunnaki are described not just as gods in the later, familiar sense, but as a group of powerful beings associated with both the heavens and the earth. They were connected to the stars, the deep places, and the forces that shape the natural world. Because they were tied to the environment, their actions were often seen through the lens of nature itself. If a storm was unusually violent, if a river changed direction, or if a flood swept across the land, people believed the Anunnaki had either caused it or allowed it. This connection between the Anunnaki and environmental events was not meant to be symbolic. It was practical. People living in river valleys or floodplains did not have access to meteorology or geology. They remembered what happened through stories, and those stories placed responsibility in the hands of beings who represented forces beyond human control. The idea that the Anunnaki could influence storms, floods, or even the rise and fall of civilizations came naturally from this worldview. Among the earliest flood legends, the Anunnaki appear not only as observers but as decision-makers. In the Sumerian flood story, a council of gods debates what to do about humanity. Some sources suggest the Anunnaki were troubled by the noise and disorder of humans. Others imply the world had become unstable. Whatever the cause, the flood was presented as a deliberate event, one overseen by beings associated with power, wisdom, and cosmic order. Behind these narratives may lie fragments of memory from real events. If ancient people witnessed environmental changes too large to explain, the involvement of the Anunnaki provided structure to the story. This didn't reduce the seriousness of the event. It made the event understandable. When the waters rose beyond anything known, it felt natural to place the cause in the hands of beings who governed forces larger than life itself. The Anunnaki were often grouped with specific roles. Some governed the heavens, some ruled the earth, some were guardians of the deep places, and some served as intermediaries between these realms. This organization gave structure to the way ancient people interpreted natural events. If a flood came from heavy rain, that could be attributed to a deity associated with the sky. If the floodwaters came from beneath the earth, that could be linked to a deity associated with the underworld, or the deep freshwater sources. When the event seemed too large for a single explanation, the full council appeared in the story. This framework becomes especially interesting when examining how ancient people understood unusual celestial phenomena. If a strange object appeared in the sky, a wandering planet, a bright visitor, or something unfamiliar, the event could easily be interpreted as a sign from the heavens. The Anunnaki, associated with celestial order, would naturally become part of that interpretation. In some texts, the Anunnaki are described as those who decree the fates, a phrase suggesting their decisions shaped both cosmic and earthly events. If a wandering celestial body influenced tides, triggered storms, or destabilized weather systems, ancient skywatchers might have interpreted the object as a manifestation of the Anunnaki themselves or a sign of their involvement. These interpretations didn't represent superstition. They represented the best attempts of early people to understand events that were overwhelming and real. In flood stories across Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki appear as more than distant observers. They react emotionally. Some express regret. Some express fear. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the tablets describe the Anunnaki trembling during the flood, climbing to high ground and watching the destruction. This detail, deities reacting the same way humans would, might indicate an attempt to convey the scale of the event. If even the cosmic powers reacted with fear, then the flood must have been larger than anything the people had ever known. This idea aligns with the possibility that a real event, one involving large-scale environmental changes, influenced the formation of the story. If a catastrophic surge of water overwhelmed cities and landscapes, the people who survived would have needed a way to express the scale. The Anunnaki becoming frightened or taking refuge could reflect the overwhelming nature of what happened, rather than literal divine emotion. Other flood texts mention that after the waters rose, the Anunnaki gathered around a fire like frightened animals. This image is unusual for divine beings. It feels more like a memory of something witnessed by humans, transformed into a narrative that made sense in the cultural context. If the event had celestial connections, something unusual appearing in the sky at the same time the environment changed, people may have believed the Anunnaki were both witnesses and participants in the unfolding disaster. There is also an interesting pattern in ancient Near Eastern texts describing the Anunnaki as keepers of knowledge, especially knowledge related to the heavens. Some were associated with stars, some with weather, some with the underworld's vast reservoirs of water. This variety of roles allowed them to appear in any story involving major transformations of the world. When ancient people preserved these narratives, they did so with the intention of carrying forward information. They may not have understood orbital mechanics, gravitational influence, or tectonic stress, but they understood that something powerful caused the flood. They described that power through the actions of the Anunnaki. Whether the Anunnaki were seen as keepers, witnesses, or engineers of the storm depended on the community telling the story. In some accounts, the Anunnaki appear remorseful after the flood. They meet with the survivors, offer guidance, and establish new rules for humanity. This reinforces the idea that the story wasn't just about destruction, it was about transformation. The world before the flood and the world after were different. People believed the Anunnaki had shaped both. Other traditions portray the Anunnaki as divided. Some opposed the flood. Some tried to warn humanity. Some felt compassion. These variations suggest that the story preserved complex human feelings. Real events often lead to disagreement, confusion, and differing interpretations. The flood narrative may reflect these dynamics. People living through the same event might remember it differently. When these memories merged into narrative form, the Anunnaki became a way to express the different perspectives. Another dimension to consider is the connection between the Anunnaki and early human civilization. In Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki were responsible for teaching humanity agriculture, writing, and organizational skills. They were seen as the origin of order and structure. If the flood destroyed early settlements, early fields, and the first attempts at organized communities, it would make sense that the Anunnaki became part of the story describing how civilization restarted afterward. The flood wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a disruption of everything the people believed the Anunnaki had established. The rebuilding process, teaching, organizing, instructing, mirrored the stories of the Anunnaki establishing civilization in the first place. This continuity reinforced the belief that the Anunnaki played an essential role in both the collapse and the restoration. In some later texts, the Anunnaki are linked to specific celestial markers. Scholars have interpreted these links in different ways. Some believe the references describe stars used for navigation. Others think they refer to planets. Still others argue the Anunnaki were symbolic representations of natural forces. Regardless of interpretation, the association between the Anunnaki and celestial signs remains consistent. If ancient people saw a wandering object in the sky, before or during the events associated with the flood, they would have interpreted that object through the lens of the Anunnaki. This leads to another possibility. If a real celestial object passed near Earth and influenced tides, storms, or climate patterns, ancient observers might have thought the Anunnaki were responsible. The object could have been seen as one of their signs or manifestations. This idea would naturally become part of the flood narrative, especially if the flood itself was catastrophic. In this sense, the Anunnaki were not simply mythic figures. They were part of an early explanatory system. They gave shape to questions about why the environment changed, why cities were destroyed, and why some survived while others did not. When the waters receded and people rebuilt their lives, the stories of the Anunnaki helped organize the memory of what had happened. In flood stories from other regions, stories not connected to Mesopotamian culture, the same pattern appears. Beings associated with the sky or higher powers intervene, warn, or guide. These beings are not always identical to the Anunnaki, but their roles serve the same purpose. They explain the event, they offer guidance, they represent forces larger than humans. They carry knowledge about what came before and what must come after. This global pattern suggests that people everywhere saw large floods as events requiring explanation beyond the familiar world. They turned to beings who symbolize cosmic order, ancestry, or control over natural forces. The Anunnaki filled this role in Mesopotamia because they were already tied to the structure of the cosmos. Their presence in the flood narrative didn't come from superstition. It came from the cultural framework that described how the world worked. As the story of the flood passed through centuries, the Anunnaki's role evolved. In some later texts, they became more distant. In others, they became more symbolic. But their early connection to the flood remained embedded in memory. For people living in ancient Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were not imaginary beings. They were the explanation for forces beyond human understanding. And so, when people told their descendants about the flood, they described the involvement of the Anunnaki, not because they wanted to embellish the story, but because they needed a way to describe the magnitude of what happened. The flood felt immense, the waters rose too fast, the destruction felt absolute. Only beings associated with cosmic power could explain an event of that size. As we move forward, the next part looks at how ancient scholars, skeptics, and observers attempted to interpret these stories in later eras, how they searched for historical clues, geological evidence, or astronomical patterns to determine whether the Great Flood had a cause rooted in the natural world, the celestial world, or both. When people in the ancient world looked up at the sky, they relied on what they could see. The stars, the planets, the motions that repeated year after year. But when modern scholars look back at ancient texts, they rely on something else entirely. They rely on fragments, pieces of clay, lines carved into stone, myths preserved through memory, and stories that have travelled across thousands of years. From these pieces, they try to reconstruct how early civilizations understood the cosmos, and somewhere in the middle of this reconstruction, the idea appears again. A planet that comes and goes. Not a familiar world like Venus or Mars. Not a comet with a bright tail. Something different. Something described as a crossing point. Something that appears in one era's texts, fades in the next, and resurfaces centuries later with a slightly different shape. Something that ancient people remembered strongly enough to record, but modern scholars struggle to interpret with certainty. This has created a puzzle that no single field has been able to solve alone. Astronomers approach it one way, historians approach it another, linguists add their own interpretations, and skeptics, seeing the inconsistencies, argue that the ancient references don't describe a real planet at all. Yet despite disagreement, the question continues. Did ancient people remember something in the sky that modern science has not yet identified. To untangle this, we have to look at how knowledge shifted over time. Ancient astronomers, especially in Mesopotamia, recorded the sky with remarkable dedication. Their tablets list star positions, planetary movements, rising and setting times, and unusual events. These records are not vague. They are precise enough that modern researchers can match some entries to real astronomical phenomena. But the clay tablets were not written in a single era. They span many centuries, and over those centuries the meanings of certain words changed. One generation used a term to describe a star, another used the same term to describe a planet, a third used it to describe a sky region. When scholars today encounter these shifting definitions, they face a challenge, determining what the original observers meant. The word sometimes linked to the idea of a wandering world, Nibiru, is a prime example of this challenge. In some tablets, it appears clearly connected to a specific star used to mark seasonal transitions. In others, it seems tied to Jupiter. In still others, it is referenced in a way that suggests a celestial object behaving unusually. Because the meaning changes, skeptics argue that the word never referred to a physical planet at all. Instead, they believe it was a symbolic or ritualistic term. But not everyone agrees. Some scholars believe the changing definitions themselves are clues. If a celestial object appeared irregularly, rare enough that only some generations witnessed it, people might reinterpret it each time it appeared. Without consistent visibility, without instrumental measurements, knowledge would shift. A rare visitor would not behave like the known planets, and so it might be described differently by each culture that saw it. Modern astronomers face a similar challenge when studying the hypothetical Planet 9, a large, distant object that may exist far beyond Neptune. They have never seen it directly. They infer its existence from the behaviour of far-flung objects in the outer solar system, but the data is incomplete and the planet has not yet been confirmed. Even with modern telescopes, the outermost parts of the solar system remain poorly understood. If something as large as a distant planet can elude detection today, it becomes more reasonable to consider how much older civilizations might have missed, or partially witnessed, or misinterpreted. Skeptics point to inconsistencies in ancient flood stories and celestial references as evidence that the wandering world is myth, not memory. They argue that similar flood stories emerge simply because many cultures live near water. They propose that the wide distribution of myths is a natural result of human imagination, not shared experience. These arguments are logical in a narrow sense. Many myths do arise independently. But what challenges this perspective are the specific details repeated across continents, details that align with geological findings and ancient astronomy. Not every culture described a planet that crosses through the sky, but many described something unusual appearing before major floods. In some accounts, the skies darkened. In others, the stars moved strangely. In others still, a bright object travelled slowly, not like a meteor or comet, but like something that drifted in ways unfamiliar to early observers. Skeptics attribute these descriptions to symbolic storytelling. Scholars who study comparative mythology agree that symbolism plays a role, but they also acknowledge that myths often preserve memories of real events. The challenge for modern researchers is separating metaphor from memory. To approach this puzzle, scholars analyse ancient languages. They look at how words changed over time. They examine how scribes use certain terms in different contexts. The term associated with a crossing world appears in astronomical texts, ritual texts, and narrative stories. Sometimes it is used literally, sometimes symbolically. Determining which is which requires careful interpretation. But even with careful reading, the picture remains unclear. The tablets do not provide diagrams or precise measurements. They provide descriptions shaped by the worldview of the time. They speak of the heavens using the language of myth and meaning. This creates room for multiple interpretations, none of which can be proven definitively. Some researchers take a cautious approach. They argue that ancient people did not have the tools to identify planets accurately, so their references cannot be considered reliable evidence of a wandering world. Others counter that while the tools were simple, the observations were surprisingly advanced. Mesopotamian astronomers tracked the orbits of Venus and Jupiter with impressive precision. They predicted eclipses. They recognized planetary cycles that modern astronomy did not rediscover until centuries later. This suggests that when they described an unusual object, they were not speaking out of ignorance. They were speaking from experience. There are also scholars who focus on the timing of ancient flood narratives. Geological evidence shows that several major flooding events occurred near the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose quickly, glacial lakes burst, coastlines changed dramatically. These events happened across the world, often within overlapping time windows, and in some regions these events coincided with climate shifts. When researchers compare these events with ancient sky records, they notice something interesting. Some periods of environmental instability align with mentions of unusual celestial behaviour. The alignment does not create proof, but it creates possibility. In modern debates, skeptics often emphasize that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that is true, but sometimes evidence disappears long before anyone can preserve it. If a wandering planet passed near Earth thousands of years ago, its influence might be visible only in the memories of the people who lived through it, and in the geological traces we struggle to interpret today. There is also the issue of cultural transmission. Ancient cultures interacted more than we sometimes think. Trade routes connected regions. Travellers carried stories from place to place. Scholars argue that flood myths may have spread through these routes, but even if this explains some similarities, it does not fully account for the oldest flood memories preserved in isolated regions, places that had no contact with Mesopotamia, no influence from the Near East, and no shared linguistic heritage. These isolated stories also reference survivors climbing mountains, unusual skies, and waters rising rapidly. The consistency across these independent traditions suggests that the stories reflect real experiences, not borrowed myths. Modern researchers who explore the idea of a wandering planet usually belong to one of two groups. Some focus on planetary science and explore orbital mechanics, looking for evidence that such an object could exist. Their models show that it is possible, though unlikely, that a large distant planet follows an elongated orbit that takes thousands of years to complete. These models try to determine how such a planet would influence the solar system, including Earth. The second group of researchers focuses on ancient records, examining all references to unusual celestial events. They compare myths, analyse texts, and explore whether the idea of a crossing world could be based on a real observation. Where these two groups overlap lies the puzzle. Could ancient descriptions correspond to a real object that modern astronomers have not yet identified? Skeptics answer no. They point out that modern telescopes have searched the sky extensively. They argue that a large object would have been detected, but this argument assumes that the planet, if it exists, behaves like the known planets. If its orbit is extremely elliptical, if it spends most of its time in far, cold regions, or if its surface reflects very little sunlight, detection becomes difficult even with modern instruments. This possibility keeps the discussion alive. The puzzle does not end with astronomy. Scholars studying comparative mythology have found that ancient stories often preserve real geological or climatic events. For example, stories about volcanic eruptions exist in cultures that lived near active volcanoes with remarkable accuracy about the sequence of events. Flood myths also often match the geological evidence in the regions where they originated. If ancient people preserved memories of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes accurately, it becomes reasonable to consider that they might also have preserved memories of unusual sky events that accompanied major environmental shifts. Skeptics, however, argue that humans are prone to seeing patterns even when none exist. They propose that flood myths became widespread simply because flooding was a common hazard for many early civilizations. In their view, the similarity of flood stories across the world is the result of similar experiences, not a shared event. But the scale described in many legends goes beyond typical flooding. The rapid rise of water, the involvement of mountains, the complete reshaping of landscapes. These elements suggest something larger than seasonal floods. And when these descriptions align with geological records of abrupt sea level rise, massive glacial outbursts and coastal inundation, the possibility of a larger event becomes harder to ignore. Another challenge arises when skeptics focus on the symbolic nature of myths. They argue that ancient people used myths to explore human themes, creation, destruction, rebirth, and that flood stories reflect these symbolic cycles. Scholars agree that myths often carry symbolic meaning, but symbolic meaning does not exclude historical memory. Many myths contain layers, symbolic on the surface, historical underneath. Determining which parts reflect memory and which reflect metaphor is complex. Modern science often seeks clean answers. Ancient stories do not provide them. Instead, they offer threads, clues, hints, aspirations, warnings. These fragments make up a story that must be pieced together from multiple fields of study: geology, astronomy, anthropology, linguistics, and environmental science. When skeptics examine these fields separately, they see no definite proof. When scholars examine them together, they see a pattern. Still, no consensus exists. Some researchers believe the wandering world described by ancient people was not a physical planet, but a conceptual marker, a symbol used to describe transitions or cosmic events. Others believe it was a real object, observed occasionally by ancient astronomers and woven into their stories because of its rarity. Both perspectives continue to coexist because the evidence can be interpreted multiple ways. What remains undeniable is the persistence of the idea. The concept of a crossing world appears in multiple sources across multiple eras. It appears in astronomical texts, myths, king lists, and flood narratives. It re-emerges in different time periods with different meanings, but maintains a connection to unusual celestial behaviour and environmental change. Modern astronomers searching for unknown planets acknowledge that the outer solar system is far from fully mapped. The possibility of a distant, massive body still lingers in scientific debate. As long as that possibility remains, so does the potential connection between ancient memories and modern models. The puzzle persists not because the evidence is clear, but because it is incomplete. Every fragment adds something but never reveals the whole picture. Every interpretation answers a question but introduces new ones. The story continues because it bridges the worlds of ancient observation and modern science, memory and geology, skepticism and curiosity. As we move forward, the next part explores how ancient traditions carried these stories into later times, how scholars, scribes, and storytellers tried to make sense of the world using the tools they had, and how those interpretations shaped the belief that the flood and the wandering world were tied together in ways still discussed today. When people today try to understand what happened during the ancient flood described in stories across the world, they face a challenge that no single discipline can solve alone. Myth preserves memory. Science measures evidence. One uses stories to carry meaning. The other relies on data to build explanations. At first, these approaches seem entirely different. Yet when dealing with an event that shaped the memory of humanity, the two must eventually meet. They must sit beside each other, compare what they know, and try to reconstruct something that happened long before writing became common, long before cities rose, and long before the world looked anything like it does now. The process begins by recognizing that ancient myths were not random stories. They were attempts to record reality using the tools available. When something large happened, something that overwhelmed communities or reshaped landscapes, The memory of it was preserved through storytelling. Parents told children, elders instructed the next generation, travellers carried the account to neighbouring groups. Over time, the details adapted to local settings, but the core remained. A flood came. The world changed. Only a few survived. Modern scientists, on the other hand, rely on measurements. They search for evidence in ice cores, sediment layers, fossil patterns, tree rings, and the shapes of ancient shorelines. They look for markers of sudden climate change. They study the behaviour of sea levels over thousands of years. Their goal is not to preserve memory, but to understand the physical world. For a long time, myth and measurement were kept separate. Scholars in one field didn't often consult those in another. Myths were seen as symbolic, while science was seen as precise. But in recent decades, researchers realised something important. Ancient stories sometimes contain remarkably accurate descriptions of real events. Not in scientific language, but in vivid imagery describing what people actually experienced. This realization opened the door to a new approach, comparing myths with physical evidence, not to prove one with the other, but to see where they might align. This alignment, when it appears, can provide a deeper understanding of events that shaped human history. To begin reconstructing a lost global flood, scientists look at the end of the last ice age. During this period, enormous ice sheets covered large parts of North America, Europe, and Asia. These sheets were unstable. They melted, fractured, reformed, and collapsed. Their movement affected sea levels across the world. Measurements show that sea levels rose dramatically, over 100 metres from the height of the Ice Age to the warm period that followed. But this rise did not happen slowly and evenly. There were pulses, sudden jumps, periods when sea level increased rapidly, in some cases faster than any changes seen in modern times. One of these pulses, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred roughly 14,600 years ago. During this event, sea levels rose by several metres in just a few centuries. Scientists studying coral reefs and submerged coastlines have found evidence that entire regions flooded in a short span of time. This would have been catastrophic for the communities living there. Coastal settlements would have vanished, river valleys would have filled, islands would have been submerged. Another pulse occurred later, around 11,000 years ago, during a period of climate instability. These pulses were large enough that ancient people would have seen coastlines disappear within a generation. For communities living close to the sea, the experience would have felt like the entire world was sinking. These measurements from geology match the scale described in many flood myths. The stories speak not of ordinary flooding, but of water rising too fast for people to comprehend. Enough to cover mountains or high ground, enough to reshape the world. But sea level rise alone is not the full story. To reconstruct a lost global flood using both myth and measurement, we must also look at glacial lake bursts. As the ice sheets melted, they formed enormous lakes held back by walls of ice or unstable sediment. When these walls failed, the lakes released massive floods that travelled across continents. One of the most famous examples is the burst of glacial Lake Missoula in North America. When its ice dam gave way, a torrent of water swept across the region, carving dry channels into the land that are still visible today. The flood was so large that it temporarily changed the landscape on a continental scale. Ancient people living nearby would have fled to higher ground, and their descendants would have preserved the story, and indeed, indigenous groups in the region do have stories of great floods. Similar glacial bursts occurred in Europe and Asia. Each time, the release of water was immense. These bursts would have been sudden, violent, and unforgettable. Combining these floods with rapid sea level rise creates a picture of a world undergoing extreme and unpredictable change. A world where multiple regions experience catastrophic flooding within a relatively short time. Myth adds another layer to this picture. Many ancient stories describe not only water rising, but skies behaving strangely. People speak of darkened sun, unusual stars and bright objects moving across the heavens. While these descriptions may be symbolic, they could also reflect real atmospheric conditions caused by volcanic eruptions, meteor activity, or unusual celestial events. Large eruptions, for example, can darken the sky for months. If one occurred near the time of major flooding, the combination could have been interpreted as part of the same event. But some descriptions do not align with volcanic activity. They describe objects in the sky moving in slow, steady ways, not like meteors, not like comets, but like something drifting. These descriptions raise questions about whether ancient observers witnessed a rare celestial event at the same time the Earth was undergoing environmental instability. Modern measurements provide clues. Some researchers studying long-term climate cycles suggest the possibility of external influences on Earth's climate during certain periods. These influences might include changes in solar output, orbital variations, or gravitational interactions with large bodies in the solar system. While none of these ideas are proven, they remain areas of ongoing research. Another place where myth and measurement intersect is in the study of ancient shorelines. Archaeologists have found submerged settlements off the coasts of India, Japan, Europe and the Americas. These sites were inhabited during a time when sea levels were much lower. Their sudden submergence suggests rapid water rise. Some of these sites are deep enough underwater that their flooding would have felt like a major event to the people who lived there. In the Persian Gulf region, for example, there is evidence that a fertile valley now underwater may have been home to early communities. When sea levels rose, the valley flooded. Some researchers suggest this area may be connected to the memory of a great flood in ancient Mesopotamian stories. The connection is speculative but plausible. Reconstructing a lost global flood means considering many layers together. Sea level rise, glacial bursts, shifts in currents, changes in rainfall, seismic events, and possible celestial influences. It requires seeing the Earth not as a static planet, but as a dynamic system sensitive to both internal and external forces. Myth helps fill in gaps. Measurement helps anchor memory in physical reality. When the two align, even partially, a more coherent picture emerges. For example, many flood myths include the detail that people survived by climbing mountains. Measurement supports this. As seas rose, the first places to remain above water would have been elevated areas. Communities forced to flee rising waters would have naturally headed upward. Their descendants would have heard the story of escape to higher ground. Some myths include the detail that the flood covered the tops of mountains. This detail is harder to match to measurement, but it could reflect the perspective of people living in regions where local geography made high ground limited. If a flood reached the highest hill in their region, they may have described it as covering the mountain, even if larger mountains existed elsewhere. Another detail found in many myths is the idea that the flood was global. Measurement shows that while sea level rise was global, flood events were uneven. Some areas flooded dramatically, others less so. But ancient communities would not have known what was happening elsewhere. If their entire world flooded, their descendants would describe it as a flood that covered everything. When trying to reconstruct ancient events, it's important to remember the difference between global impact and global perception. If multiple regions experienced major flooding at similar times, the memory could become global through oral tradition. Myth would capture the emotional truth, even if the literal scale varied by region. Some stories describe a warning before the flood, a sign in the sky or a message from beings associated with the heavens. Measurement cannot confirm warnings, but it can reveal patterns. Some climate shifts were preceded by unusual solar behavior, others by volcanic eruptions that filled the sky with ash, others possibly by external gravitational influences. Ancient observers who saw these unusual events would have interpreted them as omens or signals. As researchers compare myth and measurement, certain themes emerge. The most consistent are sudden water rise, widespread destruction, survival on high ground, and celestial signs. These themes reflect both human memory and natural processes. On the measurement side, scientists cannot point to a single global flood. Instead, they see clusters of major events: rapid sea level rise, glacial bursts, coastal submergence. These events occurred in different regions but within overlapping time periods. Combined, they may form the basis of the global memory that myth preserved. On the myth side, storytellers did not record measurements. They recorded experiences: the experience of watching water rise too fast, the experience of losing land, the experience of escaping, the experience of seeing the sky change before or during the event. These experiences became the mythic structure that appears around the world. Reconstructing the lost flood means weaving these threads together. It means seeing the stories not as literal in every detail, but as reflections of lived reality. It means accepting that myth contains truth, and measurement contains gaps. Science cannot recover every detail of the ancient world. Myth cannot provide exact data, but together they create a picture of a world where multiple forces acted at once: melting ice, unstable climate, shifting oceans, tectonic pressures, and possibly the influence of a celestial visitor. As the pieces come together, we begin to understand why the flood became one of the most universal memories in human history. It wasn't one event, it wasn't one region, it wasn't one cause. It was a convergence, a time when the Earth's systems reached a point of instability, and the consequences were felt across continents. The ancient people remembered this convergence through stories that endured for thousands of years. Today, scientists trace it through the layers of the Earth. And somewhere between these two worlds, myth and measurement, the lost flood becomes visible again. As we continue, the next part explores the search for direct evidence underground, underwater, and in the deep layers of sediment, places where the physical traces of ancient floods wait to be uncovered, offering clues that may deepen our understanding of what the earliest people lived through and why those memories shaped their beliefs about the wandering world. When people imagine scientists searching for evidence of an event as huge as the ancient flood remembered across so many cultures, they might picture researchers digging in deserts or exploring mountain caves. But the real search happens in places that hold the long memory of the Earth, layers of ice that formed over tens of thousands of years, sediment beneath oceans that has been untouched since the first human communities walked the land, stone walls, carvings and ruins built by civilizations that witnessed changes and left behind fragments to explain what happened. Finding evidence for a flood that reshaped the memory of the world requires looking in all of these places at once. Each provides a different piece of the story. Some offer physical traces, others offer patterns, others point to the timing of events. When these pieces are placed together, they create a picture that helps explain why the ancient flood stories are so persistent and why so many of them share similar details. The first and perhaps most powerful archive of Earth's past lies in the ice. Huge sheets of ice in Greenland and Antarctica preserve air pockets, trapped over hundreds of thousands of years. When scientists drill deep enough, they pull up long cylinders of ice called cores. Each layer in a core represents a year or a season or a shift in temperature. By studying the composition of each layer, scientists can see changes in atmosphere, volcanic activity, rainfall patterns, and temperatures stretching far back into prehistory. Ice does not lie. It records every shift. When researchers study the ice cores from Greenland, they find something striking. There are periods where the composition of the ice changes abruptly, periods where temperatures increased suddenly, periods where levels of certain trapped chemicals spike, suggesting massive environmental disturbances. These shifts don't appear gradually, they appear sharply, sudden, unexpected. These rapid changes match the time frames where geological evidence shows sea levels rising quickly. When those sea levels rose, the people living near coasts would have seen their land consumed by water. They would have fled inland or upward. Their descendants would have heard the stories for generations, and ice formed thousands of miles away, records these same periods of change. Even more telling are small particles trapped in the ice, dust, volcanic ash, tiny fragments of meteor material, and chemical markers associated with fires or ocean changes. In certain layers, these particles increase sharply. Some layers show a spike in volcanic ash, suggesting eruptions that would have darkened skies. Others show changes in ocean salinity, hinting at massive releases of fresh water into the oceans from melting ice. These layers correlate with known events like Meltwater Pulse 1a and other rapid sea level rises. Though they cannot describe the flood directly, they show that the Earth experienced moments of intense, rapid environmental upheaval, the kind of upheaval that would form the foundation of flood legends. But ice alone cannot reconstruct everything. The oceans hold another archive, one that preserves evidence from times when water levels rose so quickly that land became submerged. Deep beneath ocean floors, layers of sediment gather year after year. Shells fall to the bottom, minerals settle, tiny organisms leave behind chemical signatures. Over thousands of years the layers build, forming a record that can be read like pages in a book. When researchers take samples from ocean floors, they can see changes in colour, composition, and density marking major events. Some sections show clear evidence of sudden freshwater injections. These injections disrupt normal ocean chemistry. They dilute salt levels. They change the types of organisms that survive. They affect currents. These disruptions appear at several points in the record, aligning with times when ice sheets melted rapidly. The suddenness of the change is important. It suggests that something happened quickly, much faster than normal climate shifts. Fresh water from massive glacial lakes entering the oceans in short bursts would have caused this, and the people living near those lakes would have witnessed the resulting floods. In some regions, sediment layers show thick deposits of sand, gravel and silt carried by enormous waves. These layers are too large to be from ordinary storms or tsunamis. Some of them stretch across huge areas, suggesting that the waves were part of regional megafloods. These megaflood deposits support the idea that large volumes of water moved quickly across landscapes, overwhelming anything in their path. If these floods occurred in multiple regions within a similar time frame, they could have contributed to the widespread memory of a great flood. Not a single global event, but a series of massive events tied to the same underlying cause: climate instability and rapid sea level rise. The ocean floor also preserves evidence of changes in current patterns. During the end of the last ice age, the switching of major currents radically altered weather patterns. This kind of change could produce storms far more intense than anything modern coastal communities face. If storms became stronger, rain patterns shifted, and winds changed direction, the result would have been unpredictable flooding and severe weather. This combination of factors — rapid sea level rise, glacial bursts, mega floods and storm surges — creates a picture of a world undergoing transformations at a scale that would have shaped human memory permanently. But researchers also look for evidence on land. Not all floods leave traces underwater. Many leave signs in valleys, in caves, in riverbeds, and in the cracks of ancient rock formations. One type of evidence appears in the form of sediment layers far above current river levels. These layers suggest that rivers once carried far more water than they do today. When geologists study these deposits, they sometimes find signs that the water was moving at enormous speed, faster than any known historical flood in that region. These ancient flood layers can stretch for miles, showing the massive scale of the event. Another form of evidence appears in cave systems. When water levels rise quickly, caves can fill with sediment and minerals. As water enters, it leaves behind layers of material. When the waters recede, the layers become preserved within the cave. Today, scientists study these layers to understand when major floods occurred. In some caves, these layers date back to the same periods identified in ice cores and ocean sediments. They show that inland areas experienced major flooding at the same times that seas were rising. This supports the idea that the floods described in myths were part of a broader pattern. Ancient stone structures also provide clues. Many early civilizations carved records into walls, columns, and monuments. Flood stories appear in some of these carvings. But beyond the carvings themselves, the physical condition of the structures tells a story. Water damage, sediment accumulation, layers of silt trapped between foundation stones, patterns of erosion inconsistent with ordinary rainfall. These physical traces reveal that some ancient structures experienced flooding severe enough to leave permanent marks. In Mesopotamia, for example, archaeologists discovered layers of silt beneath the ruins of several ancient cities. These silt layers were thick and uniform, unlike layers left by normal river activity. They suggest a large, sudden flood, and these layers appear at sites associated with some of the earliest written flood stories. Similar layers have been found in other regions, places where ancient people had no direct contact with Mesopotamia. These layers support the idea that major floods occurred in multiple areas around the same period. Sometimes the evidence takes the form of abandoned settlements. Archaeologists studying ancient coastlines have found entire communities submerged underwater. These submerged sites were once dry land. Their presence indicates that sea levels rose quickly enough to force abandonment. Some sites show signs of hurried departure, tools left behind, building materials unfinished. Items that would normally have been taken during migration remain where they were. In Southeast Asia, researchers found submerged structures near the coasts of India and Indonesia. These sites may have belonged to early settlements. When sea levels rose, these communities had no chance to adapt. Their descendants preserved the memory of their disappearance in stories passed through generations. Off the coast of Europe, underwater archaeology teams have discovered remnants of ancient forests now buried under the sea. These forests once grew miles from the shoreline. Their submergence reflects dramatic sea level rise that occurred within the last 10,000 years. Each discovery adds another piece to the picture. None alone proves the existence of a single global flood. But together, they show that the world experienced a period of intense flooding across many regions. Another branch of research involves studying fossil patterns. When seas rise quickly, saltwater can invade freshwater areas, killing plants and animals adapted to river environments. These changes become visible in the fossil record. Layers that once contained freshwater species suddenly contain marine species. This shift marks the moment when the sea expanded inland. In some river valleys, this transition layer is abrupt, suggesting rapid encroachment. This matches the descriptions in ancient stories of water rising faster than people could escape. Stone carvings provide more clues. Some ancient cultures documented celestial events alongside descriptions of environmental disasters. They did not record these events in scientific terms, but they used symbols representing stars, planets, or unusual sky patterns. When these carvings appear alongside flood imagery, they suggest that the people connected what they saw in the sky with what happened on the ground. For example, some carvings show circular shapes that could represent unusual objects in the sky. Others show wavy lines associated with water. When they appear together, they create a visual link between celestial phenomena and flooding. These carvings cannot be interpreted with absolute certainty, but they reflect the worldview of the people who created them, one in which the sky and earth were intertwined. Some of the oldest surviving ruins contain layers of silt within their foundations. These layers suggest they were flooded early in their history. The people who rebuilt them did so with knowledge of the flood. The layers demonstrate that the event occurred long before written records existed, preserved not in text, but in the stone itself. Another source of evidence comes from ancient shorelines that are now dozens of meters underwater. By measuring the depth and age of these shorelines, researchers can map how fast the sea rose. The data shows multiple periods of rapid rise. These were not gentle transitions. They were abrupt enough to force entire populations to move. This movement of people would have spread stories. In some regions, groups displaced by rising seas migrated inland. Their stories travelled with them. Over generations, these stories merged with local traditions, forming new versions of ancient flood narratives. The search for evidence does not end with physical traces. It also extends to languages. Linguists studying ancient languages look for shared vocabulary related to flooding. Some words for flood, deluge, or world-covering water appear across unrelated language families. This suggests that the memory of the event predates linguistic divergence, meaning the story is older than many modern language groups. Together, these threads — ice, ocean, stone, fossils, ruins, carvings, languages — create a complex but coherent picture. They reveal that the world experienced intense environmental upheaval at the end of the last ice age. These upheavals occurred in waves. They created floods in multiple regions. They reshaped coastlines. They forced migrations. They left physical marks that can still be read today. As researchers place these pieces together, the ancient stories become easier to understand. Not as symbolic tales invented without context, but as memories of events that people lived through. Events that were large enough to remain in the collective memory of humanity. Events that changed how early civilizations viewed the world. And as these pieces take shape, they draw us closer to the final question. If people across the world preserve such consistent memories of the flood, and if physical evidence supports the scale of these events, what does this reveal about the celestial signs they described alongside them? The next part explores why the idea of a wandering world persisted in the human imagination, why it remained tied to stories of the flood, and how the memory of that connection continued through ages long after the waters receded. When people today hear the ancient flood stories told in different parts of the world, they might think of them as separate legends created by separate cultures. But when the stories are placed side by side, a pattern emerges that doesn't fade with time. The same elements appear again and again: water rising too quickly, familiar landscapes vanishing, survivors climbing to high ground, and strange signs in the sky marking the moment when everything changed. These elements persisted through thousands of years, long after the world had settled into calmer patterns, long after new civilizations rose on the land that once held the memories of earlier ones. They persisted because the event they described left a mark deeper than the flood itself, a mark carried in memory, carving itself into the stories that people told to explain who they were and what they had lived through. Understanding why the story still echoes today means looking not just at the flood itself, but at what happened to the memory of the flood. That memory remained active. It shaped beliefs, guided traditions, and became part of how early civilizations understood the world. It wasn't only a description of disaster, it was a description of a turning point. Something ended, and something began. The people who rebuilt their lives after the waters receded needed to make sense of the changes they inherited. Their parents had lived in a world with different coastlines. Their grandparents may have lived in settlements now buried underwater. Their ancestors saw rivers with different courses, valleys that no longer existed, and plains that had become ocean. These shifts did not vanish from memory. They were carried forward in stories that explained why the world looked the way it did. In many regions, the oldest stories do not focus on the destruction itself. They focus on what came after. They describe how people learned to read the land again, how they planted new fields, how they built homes on higher ground, how they learned to live with the shape of the world that existed after the flood. These stories act as a bridge between the world before and the world after. They guide listeners through the transformation, helping them understand how the past shaped the present. One of the reasons the story still echoes is that the flood became a reference point, a reminder, a warning, a memory of how fragile the balance of the world can be. When communities experienced smaller floods in later generations, they recalled the ancient one. When they saw storms gathering, they remembered the stories told by their ancestors. When they observed unusual signs in the sky, they wondered if they were seeing the same things that had appeared before the Great Flood. The story did not fade because it continued to have meaning. It remained relevant to people living in a world still susceptible to environmental changes. Another reason the story endured is the consistency with which generations repeated it. Oral traditions were woven into daily life. Elders told stories at gatherings. Parents recited them to children before sleep. Communities retold them during rituals or seasonal events. The story's preservation was intentional. It wasn't chance. It wasn't coincidence. It was the deliberate act of remembering something important enough to protect across centuries. But beyond oral tradition, the story echoed because it connected the earth to the sky. In many ancient cultures, the flood was not described as an isolated event. It was tied to something people saw above them, a sign, a light, a body moving differently from the rest. They didn't separate earthly events from celestial ones. The sky was not distant. It was a living part of the world. If something unusual appeared in the heavens, people saw it as connected to whatever happened on the ground. This connection between the sky and the earth shaped the structure of flood stories in many regions. The narrative often begins with a celestial event. A star moves strangely. A glowing object appears near the horizon. A planet brightens. A figure from the heavens descends. These signs serve as the opening moment of the story. They mark the time when the world shifted. This pattern appears in stories from Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, Asia, the Americas and the Pacific. It suggests that ancient people across different regions interpreted unusual celestial events as warnings or signs. These events may have been associated with the flooding that followed. Even if the connection was not literal, the timing would have made the link meaningful. People saw something new in the sky. Then the world changed. The memory of that connection shaped how later generations talked about both the flood and the sky. Stories became not just memories of water, but memories of a larger event, an event involving both Earth and the heavens. This dual perspective kept the story alive because it touched every part of the world people lived in. It explained the land beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. Modern researchers studying ancient stories are often struck by the consistency of these celestial references. They appear too often to dismiss as coincidence. They appear in stories created independently by cultures separated by oceans. The descriptions vary, but the idea remains the same. Something happened in the sky before the flood. These descriptions do not need to point to a single object or event. They reflect the way ancient people understood their world. In a time without scientific instruments, the sky was observed with precision because it was essential to survival. The rising of stars guided planting cycles. The motion of planets helped track time. The sky was an early form of information. If it changed, people took notice. When a rare or unusual object appeared, a bright body drifting differently than familiar ones, it became part of the cultural memory. It entered stories not as decoration but as explanation. The sky was communicating something, and the people interpreted the message. Another reason the story still echoes is the sheer scale of what happened. The flood described across cultures was not a minor event. It was something that reshaped coastlines, altered rivers, and forced entire populations to move. Events on that scale do not simply disappear from memory. They become part of how civilizations define themselves. They become part of how people understand the land they inherited. In some regions, descendants of survivors lived near the mountains their ancestors climbed. They saw the marks left by the flood. They pointed to layers of silt in caves or unusual stones washed far inland. They saw fossils in places that had once been fields. These physical traces reinforced the stories. The more evidence the people saw, the stronger the story became. Even after thousands of years, many regions still contain physical reminders of the flood. Submerged forests along coastlines, thick layers of sediment in valleys, abandoned settlements underwater. These reminders did not exist for early civilizations in the abstract. They were visible signs. They shaped how people interpreted the past. The connection between the flood and a wandering world persisted because people struggled to explain how something so massive could happen. In an age before scientific explanations, they turned to the tools available. They used stories. They looked at the sky. They imagined beings who could govern forces large enough to create or permit such an event. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki filled this role. In other regions, different figures took their place, but the idea remained: the flood was not random. It was connected to something beyond human reach, something that came from above, something that visited, something that crossed paths with the earth. This belief persisted because it offered coherence. It allowed people to see a structure in the chaos. The wandering world became a way to explain why the flood occurred, why it was so large, and why it carried such significance. Modern science has shown that external influences can affect the Earth's climate, tides, and geophysical balance. Celestial bodies can exert gravitational forces strong enough to change conditions on Earth without ever approaching dangerously close. Scientists studying orbital mechanics and long-period objects have demonstrated that planets on elongated orbits can influence the behavior of other planets. While these scientific possibilities do not confirm the ancient stories, they offer enough room to understand why early observers might have believed what they did. If the environment changed at the same time something unusual appeared in the sky, the connection would have felt natural. The memory of that connection would have been passed along as part of the story. This combination of environmental upheaval and celestial observation is one of the reasons the flood story remained strong through millennia. It contained multiple layers of meaning. It wasn't only about water. It was about the relationship between humanity and the forces controlling the world. It described a moment when people felt small in the face of something enormous. That feeling does not fade easily. Over generations, the story became a tool. Elders used it to teach children about resilience, caution, and awareness. Leaders used it to explain why certain rituals mattered. Travelers used it to connect with strangers by sharing a story that felt universal. Religious traditions absorbed it into their teachings. Scholars wrote about it on tablets and scrolls. Poets expanded it. Scribes preserved it. The flood story grew because it carried meaning that extended beyond the literal. It helped people describe transformation, how the world changed, how humanity changed, how life moved from one age into another. When stories survive that long, they gather new interpretations, they expand, they adapt to the needs of the moment, but their core stays intact. Water rose, people fled, the world changed. Something in the sky marked the moment. In the modern era, when researchers began exploring the possibility of the long-period celestial bodies, the echoes of the ancient flood stories drew attention. The idea of a wandering world mentioned in some ancient texts aligns with the idea of planets that follow elongated orbits. Although science has not confirmed a planet matching those stories, astronomers acknowledge that the outer solar system remains only partially understood. This uncertainty gives the ancient stories another dimension. They invite comparison between memory and measurement. They ask whether something once visible to ancient skywatchers could have left no trace for modern telescopes to find easily. They encourage researchers to consider how human perception and cosmic events could intersect. The flood story also echoes because the world still changes in ways that remind people of their vulnerability. Rising seas, unpredictable storms, shifting climates. These modern experiences create a quiet resonance with the ancient memory. They remind us that the forces shaping the Earth today are similar to the forces that shaped it thousands of years ago. People may not think consciously about ancient flood stories when watching news of hurricanes or storm surges, but the connection exists in the background. The ancient memory is part of the human story. It influenced how early civilizations saw the environment. It shaped their understanding of the sky. It guided the way they handled uncertainty. As the story continued through generations, it carried not only fear but also continuity. The flood was destructive, but the survivors rebuilt. They formed new communities. They created new traditions. They carried forward knowledge. The story helped people understand that even after the world changes, life continues. This message allowed the story to remain relevant. It wasn't only about disaster. It was about endurance. It was about learning from the past. Today, the story echoes in scientific research, in historical inquiry, in cultural studies, in folklore, and in the quiet recognition that the Earth remembers more than we can see at once. The ancient people who preserved the story did so because they believed it mattered. They believed it explained something important about how their world formed and why it looked the way it did. And as the search for evidence continues, in ice, in oceans, in stone, in celestial mechanics, the story continues to serve as a guide. It connects us to the people who witnessed the floods. It ties together the earth and the sky. It provides a framework for understanding transformation. Even as the world changes again, the memory of the wandering world and the waters it accompanied remains part of the human story, carried quietly through time, waiting for each new generation to hear it and understand why it endured.